Section 1. The World Behind the Curtain. There was a version of Family Guy that you have never fully seen. Not the version that currently airs on Wednesday nights, moved there after more than 15 years of Sunday evenings in what was a quiet and unmistakable demotion in the broadcast schedule. The kind of reassignment that communicates something very specific about a show standing at a network, even when nobody says anything official about it. Not the version living on streaming platforms, the one you land on when you open an app late at night and want something familiar running in the background. Something that feels like company without requiring anything from you in the way that company sometimes does. Not the version that cycles through Adult Swim in the small hours of the morning, that late-night companionship the show has provided to insomniacs and shift workers and college students and anyone else who finds themselves awake at 2 or 3 in the morning, wanting something that registers as human presence without demanding engagement. And not the version you may have grown up watching on DVD, those early season sets whose retail prices reflected an unusual certainty that the audience purchasing them cared about completeness in a way that the average television DVD buyer did not. There is a version of this show that exists somewhere behind all of those familiar surfaces, in the places that never made it past the production offices and onto a broadcast feed. In the scenes that were finished and animated and voiced and color-corrected and scored, and then quietly set aside before anyone outside a screening room had the opportunity to watch them. Some of those scenes are now available, if you know where to look. Some of them exist in foreign releases that never crossed into American distribution. Some of them are on DVD bonus reels that most people have never thought to watch. And some of them are genuinely and permanently gone, surviving only in fragments and descriptions and the memories of the people who were in the room when they were made. Those scenes, the ones that were cut and the ones that were pulled and the ones that were changed at the last moment or locked behind a rating sticker on the back of a physical disc, or simply never shown to an American audience at any point in the show's history, those scenes tell a story about Family Guy that is considerably more interesting and considerably more complicated than the one most people carry around when they think about this show. They reveal the gap between the show that was made and the show that was allowed to exist. And that gap is wider and stranger and more revealing than it probably looks from the outside. Take a moment and construct your mental picture of Family Guy. You probably see Peter Griffin stumbling into something ridiculous, his large body moving through the world with that specific combination of absolute confidence and fundamental cluelessness that was always one of the most effective physical comedy expressions in animated television. Not dumb in the way that cartoon characters who are dumb for the sake of having someone to explain things to are dumb. Dumb in the way that someone who has constructed an entirely private and deeply incorrect model of how the world operates, and who acts on that model with complete sincerity is dumb. You hear his voice, that flat and slightly baffled quality Seth MacFarlane perfected across more than 2 decades of recording booth sessions, a voice that carries in every syllable the unmistakable quality of a man who keeps encountering a world that simply refuses to behave according to the expectations he brings to it, and who never quite figures out that the expectations are the problem, rather than the world. You see Stewie Griffin in his yellow shirt and his white sneakers, standing somewhere in the Griffin house, and speaking in full and elaborate sentences about subjects that no 1-year-old has any business having opinions about. You remember those speeches from the early seasons? The ones where the contrast between the tiny baby body and the elaborate villainy of the inner life was the entire joke? The precise and devastating comedy of watching a being who looked like something you would push in a stroller, discussing plans for world domination in the kind of meticulous detail that most people do not bring even to things they are actually capable of accomplishing. You see what those speeches became later, shorter and less theatrical, increasingly replaced by expressions of personal insecurity and relationship anxiety, the criminal mastermind slowly giving way to a different kind of character whose storylines could have been lifted from any of a dozen other animated shows. You see Brian Griffin at the kitchen counter with something in a glass, that dry and slightly weary expression serving as the show's primary ongoing acknowledgement that, yes, the chaos happening around him was indeed chaos, that a reasonable intelligence placed in the middle of the Griffin household would register a continuous, low-level protest against its conditions. You see the cutaway gag, that specific and famous editorial move where everything stops and the screen just goes somewhere completely else for a variable number of seconds before snapping back to the ongoing story as though nothing had interrupted anything, as though the show had not just detoured to a beach in the 1970s, or a medieval castle, or the Hindenburg disaster, or a commercial for a product that does not exist, as though the laws of narrative cause and effect simply do not apply within the world the show is constructing. You see the Griffin family being dysfunctional in the specific way that animated family comedies are dysfunctional, which is to say, loudly and chaotically, and occasionally reaching for something that gestures in the direction of warmth. That warmth that was so much more present and so much more consistent in the earliest seasons of the show, and that became progressively harder to find as the years accumulated. That underlying current of genuine affection between these characters that the show's best moments were built on, and that its worst moments seemed to have no memory of at all. That picture is accurate as far as it goes, but it is incomplete in a specific and important way. It is a picture of the show that was allowed to exist, the version that cleared every hurdle in the production and broadcast process and made it out the other side in a form that audiences could actually access. The version we are going to spend time with tonight is the other one. It is the version that didn't make it through intact, the one that got caught somewhere along the way, on a network standard, or a real-world catastrophe, or a corporate calculation, or a judgment call by someone whose name we will often never know, about content they concluded had gone somewhere that television, at that specific moment, simply could not follow. The version that ended up somewhere other than a broadcast feed. On a cutting room floor, or locked behind an age rating sticker on the back of a DVD, or released overseas while remaining inaccessible in America, or simply never shown to any paying audience at all. What makes deleted and censored scenes so fundamentally compelling to explore is not simply the content itself, although I promise you that some of what we are going to look at tonight is genuinely surprising, even for people who consider themselves deeply and thoroughly familiar with what Family Guy was willing to do and how far it was willing to go. What makes them compelling? What gives them a weight and a significance beyond the content they contain is what they reveal about the tension that the show existed inside for its entire history. Family Guy was built around a premise, and the premise was essentially that almost nothing should be off-limits, that comedy has both the power and the responsibility to go anywhere it needs to go in order to find the truth inside a difficult subject, to find the humor in the uncomfortable and the genuinely outrageous, regardless of the discomfort that humor might create in the people it touches. And the man who built that show on that premise, who was willing to make jokes about subjects that most of his contemporaries in television would not go near, built it on a broadcast network with advertisers attached to it, and a standards and practices department reviewing every script and every animated frame and every recorded performance before it could go to air. He built it under the oversight of a network president, who was answerable to shareholders about the commercial and reputational impact of every decision made on that network's airwaves. He built it inside a corporate structure that would eventually, through an acquisition that nobody in 1999 could have predicted or imagined, become part of a parent company whose primary global brand identity is built on wholesome entertainment for children and families. A company whose most recognizable properties are beloved by 4-year-olds on every continent. That tension between the premise that comedy should go anywhere and the reality of the institutional context within which the show existed produced a body of work with layers. And learning to read those layers, learning to understand the relationship between what was made and what was allowed, and what was sacrificed in the negotiation between the two, is what tonight is about. The Fox broadcast version of the show, the one that most people have seen most of the time, is the most conservative of the available versions in almost every episode. It is the version where Peter and Lois appear to be wearing underwear in scenes where the DVD release reveals they are not. It is the version where certain dialogue gets a bleep inserted, precisely where the word that was said would have appeared, where some scenes are trimmed so that only the setup and the very beginning of the punchline make it through, where the most extreme material is removed entirely because the standards and practices process cannot find a way to accommodate it, where the show that was made and the show that airs are sometimes quite notably different things. The Adult Swim or cable version of the show runs somewhat hotter, allows certain things through that the Fox broadcast simply cannot accommodate, sometimes contains scenes in their complete form that the Fox version cut either partially or in their entirety. The DVD version, particularly for seasons 4 onward, when the production company began systematically including deleted scenes as bonus features, is the most complete record of what the writers and animators actually created before the editing process began, containing content that never made it to any television broadcast anywhere in the world in any form. And below even that level, there are scenes that didn't make the DVD either. Things cut so early in the process or so completely removed from the approved materials that they exist only as fragments and behind-the-scenes footage, as descriptions in production scripts and table read drafts, as references in interviews with writers and directors who were present, surviving in memory and in documentation, but not in footage that can be watched. Tonight, we are going to move through all of those layers with the kind of careful and unhurried attention that this material actually deserves. We are going to begin at the very beginning, with the first 3 seasons of the show, the years that produced almost no publicly available deleted material at all, because the infrastructure for preserving and releasing that material simply did not yet exist. Then, we are going to move forward through the seasons with intention and patience, pausing at each major moment that genuinely matters, spending real time with the scenes that were cut because of real-world tragedy, the episodes that were censored or withheld because of political calculations or advertiser concerns, the moments where the world outside the show collided with the world inside it in ways that neither party was fully prepared for. We are going to give extended attention to the episodes that never aired on American television, including the one episode in the show's entire history that has still never been broadcast by any American network or made available through any standard American streaming service, despite having been produced nearly 20 years ago. We are going to look at what happened when international broadcasters made different decisions about the same material, and what those different decisions tell us about the cultural specificity of what the show was doing and where its edges were actually located. We are going to explore the specific ways that Fox broadcast, Adult Swim cable, and DVD release consistently show different versions of the same episodes, the horse trading culture that developed between the production team and the network standards department, and what all of those differences tell us about the creative work being done before the editing began. And at the end of all of it, we are going to ask what this material, taken together as a body of evidence about a specific show across a specific period of television history, tells us about what kind of show Family Guy was actually trying to be, and whether the show that reached the audience was the same show that the people who made it intended. So settle in, get comfortable. Let the room get quiet around you. Let the sounds of wherever you are fade into the background, and let this be the thing you give your attention to for a while. There is a genuinely long and absorbing story here, and there is no reason to rush any part of it. One thing before we go any further. If you are watching this late at night, or early in the morning, or in whatever quiet hour you manage to carve out for yourself, drop a comment and tell me what time it is and where in the world you are watching from. I genuinely love knowing where these videos reach people, what corners of the world they travel to, what hours they find their way into. And if you are not subscribed yet, please do that before you fall asleep tonight. It takes about 3 seconds, and it helps more than I really know how to express simply. All right, let us begin at the beginning. Section 2. The Lost Seasons. What we will never fully see. From 1999 to 2002, the first 3 seasons of Family Guy have a problem that no other era of the show shares. And it is a problem that sits with a particular kind of frustration for anyone who genuinely wants to understand the complete history of what was made during this period, and why. The deleted scenes from those years are, for the most part, simply and genuinely gone, not waiting somewhere to be rediscovered when the right person looks in the right archive, not locked behind a licensing negotiation that some future deal might eventually unlock for a new generation of audiences, not sitting on a shelf in some production company storage facility in a format that simply hasn't been converted to anything accessible yet, the way so much early television content sits, waiting for someone to decide it is worth the effort and expense of digitization. Gone in the specific and ordinary way that early television material frequently goes when nobody at the time had a compelling reason to treat it as worth preserving in a systematic way. Scattered across production offices that have since relocated or been consolidated or simply closed. Existing in physical formats that nobody has taken the initiative to convert to anything that can be watched on a contemporary device. Referenced in documents that describe what the scenes contained without providing any footage to accompany the descriptions. Surviving in the memories of writers and directors and production staff who were present when they were made, but who have not been able to produce the actual material those memories are about. The years between 1999 and 2002, which most people who have spent serious and sustained time with this show tend to agree represent its finest and most consistent period of quality, the 3 seasons where the characters still had genuine depth and the humor had a real sharpness to it, and the warmth at the center of the show's premise was most reliably and consistently present in episode after episode, are also paradoxically the years most opaque when it comes to understanding what was produced and not used. We know these seasons existed. We know they were genuinely good in ways that later seasons, despite all the technical improvements in animation and the expansion of the writing staff and the maturation of the voice performances, would consistently struggle to match or recapture. We know from the Adult Swim rerun ratings that began in April 2003, and from the DVD sales figures for those first 2 season sets, that eventually convinced Fox to order an entirely new batch of episodes, that these 3 seasons connected with an audience in a way that was lasting and genuine and passionate enough to survive a 3-year cancellation period and bring the show back from what looked like permanent death. But what was actually made during those years and not aired? What was written and perhaps taken to the animatic stage, or even fully animated and then set aside for whatever combination of reasons led to its removal, is very largely a mystery that the available evidence is simply not sufficient to solve. This was not a failure of preservation on anyone's part in any blameworthy sense. Nobody decided that the deleted material from the show's first 3 seasons was not worth keeping. Nobody looked at a scene that had been cut from an episode and made a deliberate decision to destroy it. It was simply the product of where that specific moment in time fell in the larger history of how television production documented itself for posterity, and specifically, in the history of how animated television shows began to develop the home video bonus feature culture that we now take entirely for granted. When Family Guy premiered on January 31st of 1999, scheduled in the time slot immediately following Super Bowl 33, in one of the most advantageous possible placements a new television program could receive, that first episode pulling in approximately 22 million viewers to watch Peter Griffin lose his job and collect welfare, and then have his life exploded by an investigative news segment, the idea of systematically capturing and organizing and releasing deleted and cut material as a bonus feature for home video release was a practice that was still being developed and standardized across the industry. It was not yet, in 1999, an automatic part of how a show like Family Guy would think about and document its own production. The DVD format itself was still relatively new. The audience for DVD special features existed, but the infrastructure for creating them in any standardized way had not yet become an automatic part of how television production companies operated. What we do have from those first 3 years comes from 3 distinct and quite limited sources, and none of them together give us anything approaching a complete picture of what was made during this period. The first source is a small and tantalizing collection of fragments, visible in early promotional materials that Fox produced around the show's first season, and in a behind-the-scenes special that documented the production during those early years. This special has been discussed and analyzed extensively in communities devoted to tracing and documenting the history of the show, and it has also attracted serious attention from the broader world of lost and partially recovered television media, people who make it their particular interest to catalog and preserve television content that exists incompletely or that has become difficult to access through standard channels. The camera in this special moves through production materials and animatic footage in ways that provide brief and somewhat tantalizing glimpses of scenes that are clearly different from anything in the episodes that eventually aired. These moments register as different, as clearly belonging to something that was made but not used, before the camera moves away and leaves you uncertain about exactly what you have just seen. The fragments are compelling precisely because they are so brief and incomplete. They confirm that something was there, that there is a larger body of work behind what made it to air, without providing enough to understand what that body of work actually contained. The second source is production scripts. Some of the original table read scripts and first and second draft materials from the early seasons of Family Guy have made their way into the documentary record over the years, shared online by people who had legitimate access to them during the production period, described in considerable detail by writers and production staff in interviews and commentary tracks and public conversations across the decades since the show first aired, referenced in discussions of the show's history in ways that allow partial reconstruction of what was written and what the scenes being described contained. These scripts describe scenes that were clearly written and in some cases taken to at least the animatic or rough animation stage before being set aside. Reading a description of a deleted scene is a fundamentally different experience from watching it, and the difference matters in ways that are difficult to fully articulate. You can understand the structure of the joke from a script description, can follow the logic of the scene, can identify where the characters are positioned and what is supposed to happen and in what order, but you cannot feel what the timing was like. You cannot hear the specific delivery of a line by a specific voice performer in a specific recording booth on a specific afternoon. You cannot know whether the choices made in the animation enhance the moment or undercut it. Scripts give you the skeleton, but the flesh, the thing that makes a moment land the way it lands or fall the way it falls, is not in the script. The third source is material that did make it to air in its original broadcast context, but that was subsequently modified or removed in later broadcasts and in home video releases, which is a slightly different category than true deleted scenes in the strict sense, but that belongs to the same larger conversation about what the early show actually contained versus what most audiences have been able to access across the decades since those episodes first aired. The bicycle scene is one of the most frequently referenced fragments from the behind-the-scenes special. The camera is close enough to the production materials to make out that the Griffin family is on a 5-person bicycle together, navigating what appears to be a mountain road or a steep downhill stretch of some kind. Peter is on the bicycle. The physical logic of Peter being on a bicycle is already doing a specific kind of comedic work before anything else has happened, because the visual image of Peter's particular body type and his particular relationship with physics, occupying a vehicle that requires careful balance and consistent physical input from the person operating it, is inherently productive comedically. His weight is clearly causing the kind of navigational difficulties you would expect. The bicycle picks up speed in a way that nobody on it appears to have planned for. The family crashes in a heap at the bottom of whatever they were descending. What the production draft for this scene describes happening after the crash is something genuinely simple and warm and relatively quiet in the way that only comedy fully confident in itself is ever quiet. The family is in a pile at the bottom of the hill, and they are laughing. Not laughing at someone, not laughing in a way where one person's suffering is the entertainment and the rest of the family is the audience for that suffering, the kind of dynamic that would become increasingly prominent in later seasons and that would eventually define the show's treatment of certain characters in ways that many viewers found genuinely difficult to watch. This is laughter of a different kind, the shared laughter of a family that has just gone through something absurd together and finds it funny in a way that draws them fractionally closer for a moment, rather than pushing anyone further from the center. It is the laughter of people who have survived something minor and ridiculous together, and who share, however briefly, the specific warmth of that mutual survival. This was the kind of moment the early Family Guy could do with a lightness and a genuine grace that later seasons essentially stopped finding room for as the writing developed the discovery that pure dysfunction was easier to write and more reliably funny on a week-to-week basis than warmth, and as the characters gradually lost the qualities that made their warmth feel earned rather than sentimental. The cut bicycle scene would have been a small beat. It would not have been a climactic moment or a dramatic turning point. It would have been one of many small moments in those early seasons that quietly established that the Griffins, for all their chaos and dysfunction, were a family that could still laugh together at the bottom of a hill. The absence of those small moments from the later years of the show is one of the most significant ways those later seasons felt different from the ones that preceded them, even when individual jokes were just as funny or funnier. The JFK Pez dispenser scene is the most thoroughly discussed and documented piece of cut content from the entire original run, and it carries a particular weight because the creator's own retrospective public attitude toward it provides a dimension that most deleted material simply does not have. The scene came from the fifth episode of the first season, A Hero Sits Next Door, which was notable for several reasons beyond its deleted content, including being the episode that introduced Joe Swanson as the Griffin family's neighbor, and that established a specific dynamic of Joe's character in the neighborhood before that dynamic would later be substantially altered as the show aged. In the scene, a young boy exits a store carrying a Pez candy dispenser, designed and manufactured in the shape of John F. Kennedy's head. Within essentially the next moment, a stray bullet fired by a nearby police officer strikes the dispenser and eliminates the Kennedy figure from the top of it. The candy ejects from the now headless dispenser in the way that Pez candy works. The boy, not deterred in the way that an actual child encountering the situation would presumably be deterred, reaches into his pocket and produces a second Pez dispenser. This one features the figure of Bobby Kennedy on top. The staging of the scene makes completely clear what is about to happen to this second dispenser, following the exact pattern established by the first one moments before. The scene aired once on May 23 of 1999. It was then removed from essentially every subsequent version of the episode across every platform and release format. Seth MacFarlane identified it by name in a 2012 interview with Entertainment Weekly as part of a conversation about jokes he had made that he regretted, saying that the JFK Pez dispenser gag was something he would probably not do if he were making the same decision today. That specific and direct acknowledgement from a creator who had spent his entire career arguing forcefully and sometimes contentiously for the right of comedy to go anywhere it needed to go, who had defended specific episodes and specific scenes against network pressure and public criticism, who had made his general position on creative freedom extremely clear across many contexts, is worth sitting with and taking seriously. He was not making an artistic evaluation in that interview. He was not saying the joke didn't work or didn't land. He was making a moral evaluation. He was the creator of the scene, looking back at it with the perspective of additional years and concluding that something about it was wrong, in a way that goes past whether it succeeded as a piece of comedy. The Bobby Kennedy element of the gag is almost certainly the part that registered as having gone somewhere it should not have gone. The joke structure with the first dispenser, one Kennedy assassination reference delivered in a specific and unexpected way, might just about be read as a particularly dark historical gag about the specific randomness and violence of that moment in American history. The immediate appearance of the second dispenser with the second Kennedy, positioned identically and prepared to meet the identical fate, transformed the structure of the scene from a single dark reference into something that felt more like a systematic joke about the Kennedy assassinations as a general category of humor worth revisiting multiple times within the same brief scene. Something in that repetition and that systematic quality was what the creator later concluded had crossed a line he would not cross if he were making the same choice today. The pattern of material being modified in subsequent broadcasts extends beyond the Pez scene into other small alterations and adjustments across the original run, changes to lines and reruns, and adjustments to specific moments in subsequent broadcasts that the available documentation records without always explaining in detail. These changes accumulate into a picture of a show that was constantly being reevaluated against the standards of each successive moment in which it was being broadcast, where what had been acceptable or at least passable at one point in time became something that the people overseeing the show concluded needed adjustment when they looked at it again in a different context. What matters most about the deleted and modified material from the original 3 seasons is not what any individual scene contained. It is what the existence of these scenes tells us about the creative ambition of the show during that period. The things that were cut from the original run were cut because they were sharp enough and specific enough and dark enough that broadcast television in 1999 and 2000 and 2001 could not follow them where they went. They were the products of a writing room that was genuinely reaching, that was testing the edges of what the medium would allow, from a position of real creative confidence rather than mere provocation for its own sake. That quality is worth identifying and holding on to as we move further through the show's history, because the relationship between what was cut and what that cutting tells us about the creative ambition behind the material changes in ways that matter as the decades accumulate. Section 3. Road to Rhode Island and the Scene That History Swallowed. Road to Rhode Island is widely and consistently considered the finest episode that Family Guy ever produced. and the people who created it are to a remarkable degree in agreement with that assessment from the public. Seth MacFarlane has referred to it as everybody's favorite episode across multiple interviews and commentary sessions spanning many years, a characterization he has offered with the particular tone of someone who is not being falsely modest, but who is also aware that claiming your own work as universally beloved comes with some risk of sounding like you are not giving the rest of your work its due. Members of the cast and the production staff, when asked in interviews and on commentary tracks which episode they are most proud of, or which episode they return to most often as an example of what the show could do at its best, identified this one with a consistency that is, itself, significant. It has the specific quality of creative confidence that only comes from making something where you can feel, while you are in the process of making it, that the different pieces of the story are finding their places with a naturalness that makes the whole thing seem almost inevitable, even though nothing about the creative process is ever truly inevitable. The episode aired for the first time on May 30th of 2000, during the second season of the show's original run before its first cancellation. It was written by Gary Janetti, who would go on to be one of the most important and consistent creative voices in the Family Guy writers' room across multiple seasons before leaving to pursue other projects, and who later wrote the Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie that shared a working title with this one in a small gesture of acknowledgement of the earlier episode's importance to the show's history. The episode was directed by Dan Povenmire, who was given substantial creative latitude for the project and who would later go on to co-create Phineas and Ferb for Disney Channel, bringing with him a specific line of dialogue from this very episode, spoken by a stranger to Stewie in an airport, that became a recurring structural joke embedded in the DNA of that later show. The story is deceptively simple in its setup. Brian volunteers, perhaps more charitably than his subsequent behavior during the trip fully warrants, to travel to Palm Springs, California, to retrieve Stewie from a visit to his maternal grandparents. Stewie has been spending his time at the grandparents' home framing the household maid for theft in order to produce entertainment for himself at mealtimes, which is exactly the kind of specifically cruel and essentially sociopathic detail that defined the early version of this character with such precision and consistency. It was not that early Stewie was evil in a generic cartoon villain way. It was that his evil had specificity, had texture, expressed itself in particular and recognizable forms, rather than in abstract theatrical declarations. He framed people for things they didn't do, because he found it amusing to watch. The nature of the amusement was exactly as dark as it needed to be, and no darker. At the airport bar while waiting for the flight back to Rhode Island, Brian drinks more than he should, which is a consistent characteristic of the Brian character across the entire run of the show, though one that in the early seasons felt like part of a full and complicated portrait of a character with genuine interior depth, rather than a running joke about a dog who drinks. Their luggage is stolen while unattended at the bar. The tickets are in the luggage. Brian and Stewie are stranded in California without their belongings and without their way home. What follows is a cross-country journey that serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It is a parody of the Bing Crosby and Bob Hope Road To films from the 1940s, a series of movies built around the chemistry and banter between two specific performers traveling through ridiculous situations in exotic settings. It is a showcase for the Brian and Stewie pairing that would become the most consistently productive creative combination the show ever developed, and it is the episode in which Brian's backstory, his origin in a puppy mill outside Austin, Texas, his early removal from his mother before he was emotionally prepared for it, becomes part of the show's mythology in a way that transformed the character from a witty supporting figure into something approaching a fully realized person with an interior life the audience could actually engage with across multiple dimensions. The episode was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program. It lost to an episode of The Simpsons, which was the only animated competitor in that category at the time that had any realistic chance of winning. It is regularly cited in discussions of the best individual episodes of animated television produced during the period, and it contained, positioned roughly midway through its runtime, an airport sequence that aired once on May 30th of 2000 and that has been broadcast on American television essentially never since that date. The sequence works as follows. Stewie is navigating the airport security checkpoint with his carry-on luggage in tow. The contents of his luggage are what you would expect from an evil genius baby who has been spending his holiday at his grandparents' home and who is constitutionally incapable of traveling anywhere without bringing along the instruments of his various projects and schemes. Grenades, firearms of various kinds, possibly additional items whose specific nature is suggested by the animation of the X-ray scanner screen without being made entirely explicit. The kind of arsenal that a being who has been constructing weapon systems and atmospheric manipulation devices and mind control apparatus in his bedroom nursery since before he could walk would naturally consider essential travel equipment. The problem is that he needs to get this luggage through the X-ray scanner without the trained security personnel monitoring the machine, recognizing what they are looking at, and taking the obvious consequent action. His solution to this problem is entirely in character and entirely theatrical. He breaks into On the Good Ship Lollipop, the Shirley Temple song from the 1934 film Bright Eyes, performing it with the kind of committed and technically proficient enthusiasm that suggests this is not the first time he has used theatrical performance as a distraction, and that he has given some thought to which musical properties are most effective for this particular purpose. The security officers monitoring the X-ray machine are charmed in exactly the way he intends. The bag passes through without meaningful scrutiny. He collects himself on the far side of the checkpoint, the luggage retrieved, and offers the observation that he hopes Osama bin Laden doesn't know show tunes. The camera cuts to a different security checkpoint elsewhere in the same airport. There is Osama bin Laden, applying the identical strategy, with the identical commitment, and the identical level of theatrical investment, performing I Hope I Get It from a chorus line, the Marvin Hamlish and Edward Kleban number from the 1975 Pulitzer Prize and Tony Award-winning musical, performing it with the kind of earnest and technically engaged commitment that his musical choice requires. His luggage passes through his checkpoint with the same absence of scrutiny that Stewie's received. He collects himself on the far side. The joke is complete. The scene ends. This sequence aired on May 30th, 2000. September 11th, 2001 was approximately 15 months in the future. Nobody who wrote this scene, nobody who voiced it, nobody who animated it, nobody who reviewed it in the production process, nobody who cleared it for broadcast had any foreknowledge of what was coming. The joke was a piece of absurdist comedy about the theatrical inadequacy of American airport security procedures at that moment in time, using a figure who was internationally recognizable as a symbol of serious and genuine threat as the punchline of a visual gag about how poorly the security theater being performed at American airports at the turn of the millennium was actually designed to detect real threats from people with real malicious intent. That and only that was what the scene was designed to be and to do. There is an additional dimension to this piece of the show's history that gives it a weight and a personal resonance that pure historical coincidence alone could not produce. Seth MacFarlane, the creator and executive producer and voice of multiple central characters, including the one whose performance in this very episode is the first half of the joke that concludes with the Bin Laden punchline, had a confirmed booking on American Airlines Flight 11 on the morning of September 11th, 2001. He was supposed to be on that aircraft. His travel agent had communicated an incorrect departure time to him. He had also been out late the night before and had not slept enough. He did not arrive at the airport with sufficient time remaining to board the flight. American Airlines Flight 11 departed Logan International Airport in Boston at 7:59 in the morning and was hijacked by 5 men affiliated with Al-Qaeda. At 8:46 in the morning, the aircraft struck the north face of the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. Everyone aboard the aircraft died. MacFarlane has acknowledged this in interviews across the years since it happened, with the specific tone that the particular combination of survival and luck and the consequences of oversleeping genuinely deserves, neither dramatizing it into a narrative about destiny or purpose, nor treating it as something too enormous to discuss at all. He was supposed to be on that plane. He was not. He is alive. The people who were on the plane are not. That is the complete factual statement of what happened. The Bin Laden airport scene was removed from the episode following September 11, 2001. It was cut from the American Volume 1 DVD release of Family Guy, which covers the material from seasons 1 and 2. It was not included in any subsequent American broadcast of the episode, whether on Fox or on Adult Swim or in syndication. For a substantial period of years, the scene was essentially inaccessible to American audiences through any standard legitimate channel. The primary avenues for seeing the complete version in the United States were to own the Family Guy Freakin' Sweet Collection DVD, a greatest hits compilation that made the decision to preserve the scene and include it in full, or to own the UK or German physical media releases of the second season, where the scene was retained in international distribution in ways it was not in American distribution. The iTunes version of the episode eventually restored the scene for American purchasers at some point after the initial digital release. The Hulu streaming version of the episode was updated at some point after 2017 to include the full airport sequence. The scene is now accessible to American audiences through legitimate channels in ways it was not for a considerable period after September 2001. But the American Volume 1 DVD remains the version most commonly encountered by people who bought the physical media during the years following the show's revival. And that version of the episode does not include the airport scene. Understanding what the scene was trying to do requires engaging with it on its own terms, rather than through the frame of what happened 15 months after it aired. The comedy of the sequence does not endorse bin Laden as a figure, or celebrate the activities he was associated with, or present airline security circumvention as desirable or admirable in any way. It is doing something quite precise in comedic terms. It is demonstrating, through the extreme and absurdist illustration of an obvious and recognizable threat figure, successfully using exactly the same strategy as the show's infant evil genius, that the security screening process being performed at American airports in that period was primarily theatrical in nature. It was designed to appear comprehensive rather than to actually be comprehensive. Its purpose was to produce the impression of security rather than the reality of security, and that gap between the impression and the reality was large enough that the most cartoonishly identifiable possible threat could exploit it with a strategy as simple as breaking into a show tune. That observation was not wrong in 1999 or in 2000. It was, in fact, accurate in a way that subsequent events would demonstrate with a terrible comprehensiveness. The scene made a real and truthful observation about a genuine vulnerability in American security infrastructure, wrapped inside an absurdist comedy about a baby and a terrorist both using show tunes to distract airport security screeners. The truth of the observation did not save the scene. If anything, it made the scene impossible to broadcast after September 2001 in a way that a purely absurd scene with no grounding in actual fact could not have been. You cannot run a comedy about how easy it is to get dangerous things past airport security in the immediate aftermath of evidence that it was, in fact, that easy. The timing is the kind of coincidence that lodges in the mind and does not fully leave. Not because it implies any foreknowledge or any prophetic quality in the show or in anyone who made it, simply because it is a genuine and complete illustration of something that is always true about topical comedy, even when it is not this dramatically demonstrated. Comedy is always made in a specific world at a specific historical moment, and when the world changes decisively enough, the comedy changes with it, regardless of whether the people who made it had any control over or any foreknowledge of the change that was coming. Section 4. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, 4 Years in the Dark. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was completed and ready for broadcast somewhere in the neighborhood of 1999 and 2000. It was assigned a production code that placed it early in the second season's ordering. It was fully animated, voiced, scored, and delivered to the network as part of the standard production pipeline. And then it was removed from the broadcast schedule, set aside, and not shown to American television audiences on Fox until December of 2004. Between the completion of the episode and its first American network broadcast, 4 years passed. It aired on Adult Swim in November of 2003, more than 3 years after completion, and after the show had already been canceled and revived and was preparing its return for a 4th season. The episode that opens what would become one of the most discussed and analyzed examples of network censorship in the show's history was in many ways not an extreme piece of television. It was a carefully constructed piece of satirical comedy about prejudice, built around a specific and familiar comedic structure, written by a Jewish writer, guest starring a prominent Jewish performer, and reviewed before production by two rabbis who found its handling of the subject matter acceptable. None of that was sufficient to get it on the air for 4 years. The writer was Ricky Blitt, a member of the original Family Guy writing room who brought his own perspective and identity to the material in ways that shaped its specific character and prevented it from being what its critics feared it was. Seth MacFarlane has mentioned in DVD commentary that, before production, he showed the script to two rabbis specifically to get their response to the material and to understand whether its handling of Jewish identity and the stereotypes the episode was engaging with was doing what the writers intended it to do. Both rabbis approved the episode. Both concluded that the comedy was structured to criticize the character who holds the prejudiced view rather than to endorse that view. That Peter Griffin's logic was clearly the thing being satirized rather than being offered as a correct or acceptable framework for understanding Jewish people or Jewish identity. The plot is built around a simple premise that extracts its comedy from the gap between Peter's extremely limited understanding of a subject and the reality of that subject. Peter makes a financial decision that turns out to be catastrophically wrong, losing a significant portion of the family's savings to a confidence scheme involving tornado insurance sold by a man who identifies a specific kind of credulous and not very smart customer when he encounters one. Faced with the financial consequences of this decision, Peter concludes that what he needs in order to fix his financial situation is a Jewish friend, because he has absorbed and internalized the anti-Semitic stereotype that Jewish people possess some particular and hereditary facility with financial management that would be available to him through proximity if he could only obtain the right social connection. He befriends Max Weinstein, an accountant played by Ben Stein, who is himself Jewish, which adds a layer to the casting that is relevant to understanding how the episode was constructed. Max helps Peter recover from the financial disaster he has created through professional competence, through the skills and knowledge that come from being a trained and experienced accountant, rather than through any ethnically derived magical affinity with money. This is the joke's first level. The stereotype is wrong, and the episode demonstrates it is wrong by showing Peter getting exactly what he expected, from the wrong reasons, Jewish professional expertise turning out to be the product of education and professional experience, rather than the mysterious ethnic quality Peter believed he was accessing. Encouraged by Max's help and misunderstanding its actual nature, Peter decides that having a Jewish friend is so beneficial that his son Chris should convert to Judaism, on the theory that being Jewish will make Chris as financially successful as Max appears to be. The episode follows Peter pursuing this plan with his characteristic combination of absolute confidence and total misunderstanding of what he is doing and why it does or does not work. The musical number at the center of the episode is called I Need a Jew, set to the melody of When You Wish Upon a Star, the Ned Washington and Lee Harline song from the 1940 Disney animated film Pinocchio that won the Academy Award for Best Original Song and became one of the most recognizable pieces of music in American popular culture. A song whose melody is immediately and universally associated with the expression of sincere and heartfelt desire for something that seems out of reach. Setting Peter's anti-Semitic reasoning to this melody is a specific and deliberate comedic and satirical choice. It positions Peter's prejudice as a wish, as a sincere and earnest desire for something he believes will make his life better, which is exactly how prejudice of this kind actually functions in the minds of the people who hold it. Peter is not being malicious in his own understanding of his situation. He genuinely believes he needs a Jewish friend, and that having one will help him, and he expresses this belief with the kind of open and unguarded sincerity that the melody of When You Wish Upon a Star was designed to contain. The song uses anti-Semitic stereotypes as its lyrical content, which is exactly the thing that made Fox reluctant to broadcast the episode, and that made the network's standards department conclude the risk of audiences taking the song at face value rather than reading it satirically was too great to accept. The argument for including the song as written is that the satirical structure is clear enough. Peter is demonstrably wrong, is demonstrated to be wrong by the episode's narrative, and the song is a portrait of his wrongness rather than an endorsement of it. The argument against is that comedy that requires the audience to maintain a specific reading of obviously offensive content in order to function as intended is comedy that depends on every audience member bringing the right interpretive framework to it, and broadcast television cannot control what framework any particular viewer brings. There is a specific lyric in the full DVD version of the song that concentrated the network's concerns. At one point in the number, Peter includes the phrase, "Even though they killed my Lord." This line draws on one of the oldest and most historically consequential anti-Semitic accusations, the accusation of deicide, the claim that Jewish people as a group bear collective responsibility for the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. This accusation served as a theological justification for anti-Jewish violence and discrimination across many centuries of European history. Its presence in a song that is structured as satire of anti-Semitism, sung by a character who is clearly positioned as wrong in his views, is still the presence of the accusation in a prime-time television broadcast, and the network concluded it could not be there. When the episode was finally broadcast in censored form, that specific line was replaced with its precise opposite. "Even though they killed my Lord" became, "I don't think they killed my Lord," which reverses the theological position entirely while maintaining the rhythm and the melody and the surrounding context. McFarlane recorded the alternate line specifically for the broadcast version. The DVD preserved the original. Someone watching the broadcast version and paying close attention would notice that Peter's lips were forming the shape of different words than the words being heard on the soundtrack, a detail that illustrates with particular clarity how the negotiation between what was recorded and what could be broadcast operated in practice. The version of the Quagmire key scene that appeared on Fox was substantially shorter than the version on the DVD. In the full DVD version, the scene runs long enough to make completely clear what Quagmire has been doing instead of looking for his car keys. The implication was evident enough in the longer version that the comedy landed without requiring explicit statement. In the Fox broadcast version, the scene was cut short enough that the suggestion was significantly reduced and the joke barely registered as the joke it was intended to be. The Adult Swim version of the scene, aired when the episode eventually made it to that platform, ran to an intermediate length, hotter than Fox but not as complete as the DVD. 3 different versions of the same scene, calibrated to 3 different audience contexts and 3 different platform standards, the scene as a Rorschach test for the different institutional attitudes toward the same content at the same moment in the show's history. A legal dimension was added to an already complicated episode in 2007, when the publishing company holding the rights to When You Wish Upon a Star filed a lawsuit arguing that the use of the melody for a song with offensive lyrical content caused damage to the reputation and commercial value of the original composition. The case proceeded through federal court and was eventually resolved in 2009 in Family Guy's favor, with the court finding that the use of the melody qualified as protected parody under the fair use doctrine. The decision was a meaningful legal precedent about the limits of copyright protection when original material is used in obvious and deliberate satirical commentary. It also meant that the episode had spent nearly a decade in legal and regulatory limbo before the full question of whether its existence was legitimate was finally resolved in the affirmative. What the story of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein tells us, in its complete form across those 4 years of unavailability and the censored broadcast that eventually followed, and the legal proceedings that ran in parallel, is something specific about the distance that can exist between what a creative team intends and what institutional gatekeepers believe an audience will actually take from the same material. The writers believed the satire was clear enough. The 2 rabbis consulted before production agreed. Fox's executives looked at the same material and concluded that the risk of audiences reading the prejudice as endorsed rather than criticized was too substantial to accept, regardless of the creator's intentions and regardless of the fact that the episode's narrative structure was doing exactly the work that satire of this kind requires. The 4 years that passed between completion and broadcast are not evidence that the episode was wrong. They are evidence of the specific and unbridgeable gap that can open between what something is trying to do and what an institution responsible for broadcasting it concludes it will be understood as doing. Section 5. The Revival Years. Hidden content from Seasons 4 and 5. The DVD release culture that had matured significantly by the time Family Guy returned in 2005 meant that starting with Season 4, the home video releases began documenting deleted and cut material in a systematic and organized way for the first time in the show's history. The archive that resulted from this practice across the revival seasons is considerably richer and more complete than anything that exists for the original run, and it reveals a show that, in its early revival period, was still genuinely ambitious in what it was attempting, still producing material the broadcast version had no mechanism to accommodate, still fighting for specific scenes and specific moments in ways that suggested the creative team believed the material was worth fighting for. The Season 4 episode Petarded, which centers on Peter discovering through an intelligence test that he qualifies as intellectually disabled under the clinical definition used at the time, is an episode that even in its broadcast form required careful handling. The subject matter was sensitive in ways that involved specific language choices, clinical terminology, and the distinction between the character's position as the butt of the joke and the show's general posture toward the category of people the episode was treating. Even the episode that made it to air generated some discussion about where its comedy was positioned relative to the condition it was depicting. What was cut entirely from the broadcast and what appears on certain but not all DVD releases as a bonus feature rather than as part of the episode itself was a full musical number called Peter is Slow. The song was written as a direct parody of the Telephone Hour from Bye Bye Birdie, the 1960 Charles Strouse and Lee Adams stage musical that was subsequently adapted into a 1963 film. In the original Telephone Hour, news about a significant local event travels through a community of teenagers via a chain of phone calls, each person calling the next, and the information spreading outward through the social network in an escalating and increasingly dramatic structure. The comedy comes from the way the social machinery of teenage communication operates, from the speed and enthusiasm and dramatic inflation with which each new person in the chain receives and passes on the information. The Family Guy version used this structure to trace the spread of news about Peter's intelligence test results through the community, each character calling the next, the information moving through the social web of the show's ensemble with the same escalating enthusiasm the original musical number provided. The number was fully animated, the song was fully recorded. It was a complete piece of musical comedy production that had gone all the way through the production pipeline before being cut. The reason it was cut is documented in the DVD commentary with specific clarity. The song uses a particular slur for intellectual disability in its lyrics, and it uses it not once or twice, but enough times that the repetition shifted what the song was doing from using an offensive word in service of something larger to making the repeated presence of the offensive word itself into the primary content of the joke. The distinction the writers appear to have drawn, and that the DVD commentary implicitly endorses by explaining the cut in terms that treat the decision as reasonable, was between offensive language deployed in service of a satirical or comedic purpose, and offensive language deployed so persistently that the word itself became the thing you were supposed to react to. When the number crossed from one of those categories into the other, it became something the episode could not contain without changing what the episode was about. The Michael Jackson balcony cutaway from Peter's Got Woods in the same season drew on an incident from November of 2002 in which Jackson had held his infant son above the railing of a hotel balcony in Berlin, an act that generated enormous public discussion and that had become, by the time the episode was produced, one of the most widely recognized and referenced controversies of the preceding year. The Family Guy cutaway placed Stewie in the infant's position in the incident, referencing the event with the directness that the show's cutaway format made possible, in a way that longer storytelling formats would have made more difficult. The scene was produced, voiced, animated, and completed before being cut from the Fox broadcast version. It appeared in the bonus features of the Family Guy Off the Cutting Room Floor DVD compilation, which collected deleted material from this period into a single release specifically marketed to the show's audience as a compilation of content the broadcast versions had not included. The absence of a public explanation for this specific cut, from either Fox's standards department or from the production team in any commentary or interview context, is itself a kind of evidence. The show had been willing to make jokes about other Jackson-related controversies that did air. The specific nature of the infant and balcony reference, which involved a real child placed in a position of genuine physical danger in a way that was not easily converted into pure abstraction, may have been the element that distinguished it from the Jackson references that survived the standards process. Or, the decision may have turned on something else entirely that was never made public. The absence of explanation is a reminder that the standards process, whatever its logic, does not always publicize its reasoning in ways that allow external analysis. Season 4's Deep Throats episode is perhaps the most thoroughly documented example of how the three-version structure of the show, Fox Broadcast, Adult Swim Cable, and DVD, created genuinely different experiences of the same episode for audiences who encountered it through different channels. The couch scene at the center of the episode's subplot shows Peter and Lois discovered by Brian and Stewie in a state that requires explanation of their situation to the characters who have just walked in on them. The Fox broadcast version of the scene showed the couple clothed and reduced the implied content of the scene setup to something significantly more ambiguous than what the writers had intended. The Adult Swim version was somewhat closer to the intended version, but still not complete. The DVD version showed the couple as the writers had written them, included the additional dialogue that Lois delivers to Brian, which is the punchline of the entire subplot, and the line that makes the preceding scenes make complete sense, and allowed the comedy to function as it was designed to function. The DVD commentary for this episode includes MacFarlane describing the negotiating process with the standards department as a form of deliberate exchange, in which the production team was willing to sacrifice certain elements of the episode in order to preserve others. In the case of Deep Throats, a scene involving a taxi that included Cleveland performing a gesture toward Brian was offered to the standards department as a concession in exchange for preserving the couch scene at a level closer to what the writers had intended. This horse trading practice, the deliberate sacrifice of material that mattered less in order to protect material that mattered more, was a general feature of how the show operated in its relationship with the standards process across many seasons of the revival era. The deleted scenes that exist from this period are not only records of things that were too extreme for broadcast, they are also sometimes records of what was offered in negotiations to protect something else. Season 5's Road to Rupert featured the Brian and Stewie pairing at a level of quality that ranked among the finest examples of what those characters could do together when the episode was structured around giving them sustained time with each other. The episode contained material in its international releases, specifically in UK distribution, that the American broadcast version did not include. These were not extreme scenes or scenes cut for standards reasons. They were scenes that the episode's American broadcast slot could not accommodate for time, scenes that were restored in international distribution where the precise running time constraints of the American network broadcast format did not apply. The difference between the American and UK versions of Road to Rupert is not dramatic, but it is real, and it is a small example of how the same episode could exist in meaningfully different forms depending on which distribution channel was responsible for getting it to its audience. Barely Legal, the episode in which Meg develops an intense attachment to Brian after he takes her to her prom as an act of pity, had deleted scenes establishing Meg's emotional state and internal experience at various points in the episode that gave the comedy of Brian's situation more grounding in the specific and complicated reality of what Meg was going through. The broadcast version of the episode works on its own terms and is generally well regarded by fans of the original series as one of the better character-focused episodes of the revival era. The deleted material adds a dimension to Meg's perspective that the broadcast version only implies, making the comedy feel somewhat different when you understand the full texture of what the deleted scenes establish about her state of mind during the episode's events. What connects these early revival deleted scenes, and what distinguishes them from a significant portion of the material that was cut in later seasons, is a quality that is worth naming specifically. These scenes were cut from content that was attempting something. They were cut from material where the creative purpose was clear, where the extremity or the emotional specificity or the structural ambition was in service of something the episode was trying to accomplish. The horse trading was happening around things worth protecting. The time cuts were from material that genuinely enhanced the episodes it was removed from. The show in this period was still fighting for its most ambitious material because the creative team still believed that material was the most interesting version of what they were trying to make. Section 6. PTV and the Irony of Censoring a Censorship Episode. PTV aired on November 6 of 2005, during the fourth season of the revival period, and it arrived at a specific and charged moment in the history of American broadcast television regulation. The episode was written in the aftermath of the Super Bowl 38 halftime show, broadcast on February 1st of 2004, in which Janet Jackson's costume was disrupted by Justin Timberlake in a way that exposed her right breast to an audience of approximately 90 million viewers for approximately 9/16 of a second. The Federal Communications Commission received more than 500,000 complaints about the incident. The fine eventually levied against CBS was subsequently reduced on appeal and ultimately overturned entirely, but the regulatory and public discussion that followed the incident shaped the environment in which broadcast television was operating for several years afterward. The FCC began reviewing its own enforcement policies and public decency standards. Congressional attention to broadcast indecency increased. Advertisers became more cautious about the content they were associated with. The overall effect was a broadcast environment that was scrutinizing itself and being scrutinized more intensely than it had been in the years immediately preceding the incident. Seth MacFarlane and the Family Guy writing room had strong and specific views about the direction this regulatory attention was taking, and about the general question of what authority broadcast standards should have over creative content. These views were not abstract positions held at a distance from the personal experience of the people articulating them. The show had spent years in direct negotiation with Fox's standards department about specific content in specific episodes, had developed the horse trading culture described in the previous section, precisely because the negotiation was real and consequential and required strategic thinking about what to sacrifice in order to protect what mattered most. The people making the episode had practical, first-hand experience of exactly the system they were proposing to satirize. The premise of PTV is built around the observation that the impulse to regulate offensive or indecent content in broadcast media, if followed to its logical extension, becomes indistinguishable from an impulse to regulate all human behavior and expression everywhere. Peter discovers he can create his own television network, broadcasting from inside the house on a signal that the FCC has no jurisdiction over, and he fills it with content that broadcast television cannot accommodate. The network becomes enormously popular for exactly this reason. The FCC's response is to extend its regulatory authority beyond the television screen into everyday public life, regulating what private citizens can say and do in public spaces with the same enforcement authority it uses to regulate broadcast content. The episode follows this extension of regulatory authority to its absurd but internally consistent conclusion, with FCC agents appearing in the family's kitchen and bedroom and eventually in public parks to enforce decency standards in real-time human behavior. The satirical argument of PTV is clear and sustained and pointed. It is making a specific case that the impulse to regulate offensive content in broadcast media, however understandable its origins and however sympathetic some of its specific justifications, contains within it a logic that, if taken seriously, leads somewhere much further than its proponents intend to go. That the distinction between regulating what can be broadcast and regulating what can be expressed more generally is less stable than it appears when you follow the underlying assumptions carefully. This argument was then subject to exactly the process it was arguing against. The most significant cut from the Fox broadcast version of the episode was a segment titled Douchebags, Peter's parody of the MTV program Jackass, which had been one of the most controversial programs on American television for several years before the episode was produced. In the full DVD version of PTV, the Douchebag segment features Peter performing acts at a highway overpass that are indecent in specific and documented ways. The segment was cut from the Fox broadcast entirely, not trimmed or adjusted, but removed completely. The DVD version restores it. The content that was cut was precisely the kind of content that the episode's entire satirical argument was defending the right to produce and broadcast. The episode argued, with considerable force and clarity, that the FCC was wrong to suppress this category of material, and that the suppression of it represented an overreach of regulatory authority that had consequences beyond the specific content being regulated. Fox agreed with the FCC on the specific content and suppressed it. The irony is complete and not coincidental. It is the most literal possible demonstration of the central tension the episode was constructed to explore. The show making a pointed argument about censorship while the episode containing that argument was itself being censored by the network that was broadcasting it. There is another element of the PTV production that director Dan Povenmire described in DVD commentary in terms that make it one of the most remarkable pieces of behind-the-scenes context in the show's entire documented history. He was tasked with assembling the montage sequence that appears in the episode showing clips from previous Family Guy episodes. The argument being that the increased FCC scrutiny following the Super Bowl incident now put in question material that the show had already broadcast in its original run without generating the kind of regulatory attention that was now being focused on the industry. He went back through the show's archive to find suitable clips for the montage, and he discovered, as he went through the episodes from the early seasons, that multiple scenes and moments he intended to use had already been removed from all available versions of the episodes they came from. Content from seasons 1 and 2, material that had aired once in 1999 or 2000 and had been cut from all reruns and from all home video releases, and that existed, if it existed anywhere, only in production archives he was not able to fully access. He was constructing a sequence about censorship and found evidence of censorship at every level of the archive he was searching through. Of the clips he did find and intend to include, Fox's standards department informed him that 2 of them still could not be used even in the brief 8 to 10 second fragments he intended to lift for the montage. Content that had been cut from broadcast in its original context remained too extreme to reference even in the most abbreviated possible quotation inside an episode that was specifically and explicitly arguing against the suppression of exactly this kind of content. A censorship satire running into its subject matter at every stage of its own production and then being censored in the act of documenting the censorship it encountered is something that would seem too neat to be believable if Povenmire had not described it himself in DVD commentary that is available for anyone to listen to. The episode received strong reviews from critics who found it to be one of the stronger pieces of satirical work the show had produced in its revival period. Maureen Ryan of the Chicago Tribune identified it as one of the show's most rebellious pieces of work. It was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program for the 2005 to 2006 season. BBC Three in the United Kingdom broadcast it as part of a special feature highlighting what the network considered its best acquired American programming. These responses came to the episode in its censored Fox broadcast form, the version missing the douchebag segment and containing whatever other adjustments the standards process required. The episode that generated this critical response was already the reduced version of the episode that was made. The douchebag segment sitting on the DVD, available to anyone who purchases the physical media and navigates to the bonus features, or the extended broadcast cut, depending on the specific release format, is, in its own way, the most elegant, inadvertent self-commentary that any deleted scene in the show's history has produced. The episode argued for the right to produce and broadcast content that broadcast television would not allow. The broadcast version of the episode did not include that content. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and together, they constitute the most complete version of the argument the episode was making, that the censorship it was satirizing was real, was operational, was actively affecting this specific piece of television that was criticizing it, and would continue to affect things regardless of what any piece of satire argued about it. Section 7. Stewie Kills Lois, the Pat Tillman Scene, and the Musical We Almost Got. Season 6 of Family Guy is remembered with genuine warmth by most people who were watching the show during the period when it aired. And the 2-part special Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie is the centerpiece of that warmth. These episodes, the first airing on November 4th of 2007 and the second a week later on November 11th, gave the evil genius baby version of Stewie Griffin the fullest and most complete showcase for everything that had made the character extraordinary in the show's earliest years. In the first part, Stewie achieves the goal that had driven essentially every major storyline involving him since the very first episode of the show. He shoots Lois. She goes overboard from a cruise ship. The family is left to mourn her loss. In the second part, Lois turns out to have survived, having been washed ashore and having spent a year in recovery before returning to confront the family. and specifically to confront Stewie, leading to a climactic confrontation between the two characters whose relationship had always been the most dramatically charged relationship on the show. The episodes were exciting and funny and surprisingly dramatic. They did the thing that great serialized comedy does in its best moments. They made you feel something real while the jokes were happening. And then they ended with the revelation that the entire storyline had been a simulation running on Stewie's computer, a model he had constructed and run to evaluate the outcomes before deciding whether to act on his plans. The reset was necessary for the format. A show that had been on television for years and had a specific established world and a specific established set of relationships between its characters could not maintain a storyline in which the mother of the family was permanently dead without making structural changes to the show that the production did not want to make and that the network's commercial interests would not have permitted. The simulation reveal allowed the most dramatically ambitious storyline the show had attempted to play out to its full conclusion while maintaining the status quo that the next week's episode required. It was a choice that was honest about what it was doing. The show knew it was resetting. It built the reset into the narrative rather than pretending it hadn't happened. Within these episodes, two pieces of content are worth significant extended attention. The Pat Tillman scene was a cutaway that placed Peter Griffin in a military context, in which his commanding officer issued a series of instructions. Peter consistently misheard those instructions, each time understanding, instead of whatever the officer had actually said, a command to shoot Pat Tillman in the head. The scene was framed as commentary on military miscommunication and institutional incompetence, the specific kind of systemic failure in communication that could result in a soldier being killed by his own unit through a combination of unclear orders, inadequate confirmation processes, and the general fog of military coordination at the operational level. Pat Tillman was the professional football player who turned down a contract extension worth approximately $3.5 million from the Arizona Cardinals in order to enlist in the United States Army Rangers following September 11, 2001. He was deployed to Afghanistan. On April 22 of 2004, he was killed in Kunar province. He was 27 years old. The initial reports from the Army identified his death as the result of enemy fire. Subsequent investigation established that he had been killed by friendly fire, by members of his own unit who fired on his position during a confused engagement in which the tactical situation had broken down to the point that soldiers could not clearly identify the positions of friendly forces. The military's initial misrepresentation of the circumstances of his death, which was identified by Army investigators as a deliberate concealment of the friendly fire facts, generated congressional hearings and extensive public attention about how his family had been treated, how the truth had been withheld from them, and what that concealment said about institutional accountability within the military at the highest levels. Fox cut the scene entirely. It does not appear in any officially released version of either part of the two-parter in any format. The DVD does not contain it. No commentary provides the full text of what was in the scene beyond the general description that has been discussed publicly. Alex Sulkin, who was one of the writers involved in this period of the show's production, mentioned in an interview that MacFarlane had at some point encountered Patrick Tillman, Pat Tillman's brother, and that Tillman's brother had seen the scene and found it funny. This account, if accurate, is significant because it suggests that the person arguably most entitled to an opinion about whether a comedic treatment of the circumstances of his brother's death was acceptable or appropriate did not find it offensive. Tillman's brother had become one of the most prominent advocates for accountability in the investigation of Pat Tillman's death, had testified before Congress, had argued publicly and forcefully that the military's handling of the friendly fire concealment was a serious failure of institutional integrity. A joke about military institutional incompetence producing the specific outcome of a soldier being shot by his own unit was, in his reading, making a point that aligned with the position he had been publicly advocating, rather than one that dishonored his brother's memory. Fox was making its decision about whether to include the scene without the benefit of knowing what Patrick Tillman would think. It was making the decision in a specific moment when the controversy surrounding Pat Tillman's death was still active in public discourse, when congressional hearings were ongoing or recent, when the question of what had happened and who had concealed it and why was still being publicly litigated. The calculation about whether a comedic treatment of a soldier's death in a friendly fire incident was something that a broadcast network could accommodate at that particular moment had a specific answer, and the answer was no, regardless of what the satirical intent of the scene was, and regardless of what any individual who had a personal stake in how the story was told might have thought about it. The second major deleted element from the Stewie Kills Lois two-parter is a full musical number that appears in the DVD version of Lois Kills Stewie, but that was cut from the Fox broadcast for time. The episode as broadcast ran long in its draft form, and the musical number was the element sacrificed to bring the running time within the parameters the broadcast slot required. The number is a parody of I've Got a Little List, the song sung by the character Coco, the Lord High Executioner, in Gilbert and Sullivan's 1885 comic opera, The Mikado. The original number is structured as a catalog of social types that Coco identifies as people whose absence from society he would not mourn, people whose existence is primarily an inconvenience or an irritant to everyone around them, delivered to a bright and cheerful melody that creates the specific comic contrast between the casualness of the singer's attitude toward the prospect of execution and the severity of the subject matter being discussed so casually. The song has been parodied, updated, and performed in updated versions by countless subsequent artists and productions since 1885, its structure being well suited to topical comedy since the specific categories of person being enumerated can be changed to reflect the concerns of any particular moment or context. The Family Guy version of this number placed Stewie in the position of Coco at the moment of Stewie's greatest power, the moment in the simulation where he has actually achieved world domination and addressed his subjects as their ruler and dictator. Unlike Coco, whose threat is essentially comic and whose actual capacity for the executions he enumerates is questionable, Stewie's version of the role was backed by the entire history of the show, establishing him as a being who actually had designed and built and deployed the instruments of harm that his plans required. The contrast between Coco's fumbling civil servant qualities and Stewie's genuine competence as a villain was itself a comedic element layered on top of the parody of the original number. The decision to cut the number for time is understandable in purely practical terms. The episode was long. Something had to come out. A full musical number is the most obviously self-contained element in any episode and the one most easily excised without disrupting the narrative around it. But the loss is real, and the DVD restoration of the number makes clear what was missing from the broadcast version. The moment when Stewie finally and completely achieves everything he had been working toward since the very first episode in 1999 should be large. It should be theatrical. It should be the culmination of 8 seasons of build-up and should feel like a culmination of that scale. The I've Got a Little List number with Stewie at the height of his power, singing a Gilbert and Sullivan catalog of the people he would not miss, gives the climax of the simulation arc the theatrical scale it requires. The broadcast version of that moment is smaller than it should be, and knowing the number exists and was cut makes the broadcast version feel slightly undersized in a way that would not register as a specific loss if the number had never been made at all. Section 8. Partial Terms of Endearment, the only episode America has never seen. In the entire history of Family Guy, across more than 25 years of production and more than 400 individual episodes and 2 theatrical specials and a Christmas film and more spin-offs and companion projects than most people can enumerate from memory, there has been exactly one episode that has never aired on American television. Not a scene that was pulled before broadcast, not an episode withheld for months and eventually shown in modified form, not an episode that aired once and was never repeated. An entire finished episode, fully animated and voiced and scored and delivered to the network as a complete piece of production, that has never appeared on Fox or on Adult Swim or on TBS or on Hulu or on Disney+. An episode that has been available on DVD since September of 2010. An episode that aired on BBC Three in the United Kingdom on June 20th of 2010, watched by just under 1 million British viewers in its original broadcast. An episode that has been reviewed by critics who purchased the DVD and watched it and assessed it as a work of television comedy. An episode that is described, analyzed, referenced, and discussed in virtually every serious examination of the show's history. An episode that does not exist in any legitimate American streaming library as of the time this script was written, more than 15 years after its production was completed. The episode is called Partial Terms of Endearment. The subject is abortion. Understanding what the episode does requires understanding its structure from the beginning. The episode opens at a college reunion where Lois reconnects with a friend from her past named Naomi, who she has not seen in years. Naomi and her husband Dale are unable to conceive a child and are hoping to pursue surrogacy. Naomi asks Lois to be their surrogate. She would be implanted with an embryo created from Naomi and Dale's genetic material and would carry the pregnancy to term, at which point the child would be raised by Naomi and Dale as its parents. The arrangement is precisely what the term surrogacy describes and nothing more complicated than that. Peter's response to being told about this arrangement is a running joke throughout the episode's first act. He has difficulty understanding what is actually being proposed and keeps constructing significantly more dramatic and sexually complicated versions of the situation in his head. His misunderstanding of what is happening around him is one of the consistent comedic engines of the show's entire run, and the episode uses this misunderstanding with the specific timing and commitment that makes it work when it's working, which is that the audience sees clearly both what the situation actually is and what Peter believes it to be, and the gap between those two things is where the comedy lives. Eventually, the nature of the request becomes clear. Lois agrees to the surrogacy arrangement, and the medical procedure is completed successfully. Lois is pregnant with Naomi and Dale's child. Then, in the middle of the pregnancy, Naomi and Dale are killed in an automobile accident. Lois is now carrying a pregnancy that was intended for parents who no longer exist, and she is confronted with a decision that neither she nor Peter had anticipated needing to make: what to do about the baby she is carrying. The episode engages with this question through its characters in ways that are more substantive and more honest about the actual content of the debate than a typical Family Guy episode aspired to be. Peter, after encountering anti-abortion protesters outside a clinic and watching materials they provide him with, becomes convinced that Lois should carry the pregnancy to term and put the child up for adoption. He advocates for this position with the full and sincere investment in a position he does not fully understand that has always been one of Peter's defining characteristics. Brian argues the counterposition, engaging with questions of bodily autonomy and the nature of the decision and what Lois is actually being asked to do. Lois listens to both arguments. The show gives both positions genuine engagement and does not make the representatives of either position into obvious straw men who are easily dismissed. There is a specific exchange in the episode that has been quoted most frequently in discussions of what the episode was doing and how successfully it was doing it. Brian asks what should happen to a pregnancy that results from rape. Peter's answer, that maybe the woman should have thought about that before she asked him for directions, is a line that operates simultaneously on multiple levels. It is funny as an expression of Peter's particular brand of confused reasoning, where he has understood that something bad happened, but has located the problem in the wrong place entirely. It is also a satire of a specific kind of argument that gets made about rape and pregnancy in public debate. The argument that attempts to locate responsibility with the victim rather than engaging with the actual question being asked. The joke is doing two things at once, and the fact that Peter is the one making the argument means that the audience has a clear signal that the reasoning is wrong before Brian points out that it is wrong. The episode concludes at the Griffin family dinner table. Lois has made her decision. She begins a sentence that appears to be building toward a positive announcement about a new member of the family, structured in a way that lets the preceding words hang in the air long enough that the audience briefly expects one kind of resolution. Then, Peter turns directly to the camera and delivers the line to the audience: "We had the abortion." The episode ends. The subject of Lois's decision, its content and its reasoning and its emotional weight are delivered in 6 words, and then the credits roll. Fox Entertainment president Kevin Riley explained the decision not to broadcast the episode in terms that distinguished explicitly between the quality of the creative work and the commercial risks attached to airing it. Riley indicated that he thought the episode handled its subject matter well. that he was not making an argument that the episode was badly made or that it had failed as a piece of comedy or satire. The argument he was making was specifically about the commercial context of broadcasting the episode on a network dependent on advertising revenue in the specific economic environment of 2009 and 2010. The financial crisis of 2008 had significantly tightened the advertising market. Advertisers were more cautious about the content they were associated with than they had been in more stable economic conditions, because the marginal cost of being associated with a controversy had increased relative to their willingness to absorb that cost. Abortion, more than any other single topic, was the one that advertisers most consistently identified as content they absolutely could not be associated with, regardless of the creative quality of the treatment or the political balance of the approach. An episode of a major primetime animated comedy that centered on abortion, that engaged with it seriously and directly, and that ended with a main character delivering the word abortion directly to camera as the final line of the episode, was content that the commercial structure of American broadcast television in the specific context of 2009 and 2010 simply could not accommodate. Seth MacFarlane argued against this decision publicly, using language that was specific and direct about what he thought the decision meant. He told the New York Times that blocking content because of its subject matter was an error, and that it was the kind of error that had been made before in American television history when subjects were treated as untouchable, not because of how they were handled, but simply because of what they were about. He drew a parallel to other subjects that had, at various points, been considered impossible for primetime broadcast television, and that had become acceptable as the culture evolved. His frustration was real, and his argument was coherent. But Kevin Riley's reasoning was also coherent. He was describing an actual commercial reality in a specific historical moment, rather than making an abstract judgment about the episode's content. Both arguments can be taken seriously simultaneously. Neither one is simply wrong. The comparison between how the episode was received in the United Kingdom and how it was treated in the United States is the most clarifying element in this entire story. BBC Three did not treat the episode as exceptional. It aired on a regular Sunday slot at a time when adult animated comedies from America typically occupied. The broadcast was noted in advance in the normal way that programming is noted, without special warnings or framing beyond standard ratings information. The roughly 960,000 British viewers who watched it as a Family Guy episode, assessed it as a Family Guy episode, and the critical response assessed it as a Family Guy episode that handled a serious subject with more care and intelligence than might have been expected. It was not a cultural event in the UK. It was a television episode. The same material, the same jokes, the same narrative structure, the same ending line, landed differently in the UK, not because the content was different, but because the cultural and political landscape surrounding abortion was different. In the United Kingdom, abortion has been a legal and available medical procedure since the Abortion Act of 1967, and while it remains a subject on which individuals hold strong and varied personal views, it does not occupy the same position in British political discourse that it occupies in American political discourse. It is not the same organizing axis of cultural and political identity in the UK that it is in the United States. The episode was not more extreme in Britain than in America. The context in which it was encountered was simply different. The material that was too radioactive for American commercial broadcast television was simply a television episode in a different country. What Partial Terms of Endearment ultimately demonstrates, in its complete and somewhat extraordinary story, is the specific and precise way that the limits of American broadcast television are determined by commercial structures rather than by questions of creative quality or even of cultural acceptability in any absolute sense. The episode was well made. It was accessible to nearly 1 million British viewers without incident. It has been available on DVD for 15 years. Critics have assessed it. Fans have discussed it. The information about what it contains is freely available. The episode itself is not accessible through any standard American streaming service. The gap between the information being available and the experience being available tells you something specific about what kind of barrier this is and where it actually comes from. Section 9. Turban Cowboy and the Moment Reality Caught Up with Fiction. Turban Cowboy aired on March 17th of 2013. The critical response to the episode was not enthusiastic. Kevin McFarland reviewed it for the AV Club and gave it a D, identifying it as an episode that felt like it had been written significantly earlier than its broadcast date and that had not kept pace with the evolution of how American popular culture was thinking about and depicting Muslim characters. The episode's central plot followed Peter befriending a Muslim man named Mahmoud after they meet during a skydiving accident, Peter developing an interest in Islam through this friendship, and then the episode revealing in its third act that Mahmoud is a member of a terrorist cell. The narrative structure validated the worst version of the cross-cultural friendship story, using the format of an episode about an unlikely but sincere friendship to arrive at a conclusion that confirmed the most reductive and damaging suspicion about Muslim people that an episode ostensibly about cross-cultural friendship might be expected to challenge. The episode contained a cutaway gag that became the center of the events that followed its broadcast. Peter is being interviewed about a road race, and a flashback shows what happened during the race. He drove his car through the Boston Marathon course. Runners fell, people were injured, and in some cases, killed. The gag was built around the premise that is established across years of Family Guy cutaway gags involving Peter and large vehicles and public spaces. Peter causes mass harm through obliviousness and recklessness, through a kind of comprehensive unawareness of the consequences of his actions for the people around him. The violence in the gag was the kind of cartoon violence the show had deployed in cutaways for its entire history, played at the level of dark comedic exaggeration that its format had established as its operating register. On April 15th of 2013, 29 days after the episode aired, Jahar and Tamerlan Tsarnaev detonated two improvised explosive devices constructed inside pressure cookers near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. 3 people died in the explosions. Hundreds of people were injured. 17 people lost limbs in the immediate aftermath and in the operations required by their injuries. The city of Boston was locked down. A manhunt followed. One of the perpetrators was killed in a confrontation with law enforcement. The other was captured and later convicted and sentenced to death. What happened next with the Family Guy episode did not involve the episode itself. Footage from Turban Cowboy was edited by someone who is not publicly identified, though the edited clip was subsequently associated with and promoted by Alex Jones on his InfoWars platform. The editor took 2 separate scenes from the episode that had no narrative connection to each other in the original episode. The first was the Boston Marathon cutaway showing Peter's car striking runners. The second was a later scene in the episode in which Peter, for reasons connected to the plot of the episode and not connected to the marathon sequence at all, dials a cell phone and hears explosions in the background. The edit placed these 2 scenes together in sequence, without any of the surrounding context that established what the second scene was actually about in its original narrative context, in a way that created the visual impression that Peter was detonating a bomb at the Boston Marathon. The fabricated clip was presented as evidence that the episode had depicted the bombing, that the show had predicted the attack, that the attack had somehow been prefigured in a primetime Fox animated comedy that aired a month before it happened. Seth MacFarlane responded publicly and quickly. He used the word abhorrent to describe the edited clip and the promotion of it. He expressed his sympathies to the people who were actually harmed in the bombing and to their families. He made explicit what was clear to anyone who watched the original episode. The second scene had nothing to do with the marathon sequence, was not connected to it in the episode's plot, and the edited clip was a fabrication rather than a genuine record of what the episode contained. Fox removed the episode from its website, from its Amazon listing, and from Hulu the same day MacFarlane issued his statement. The decision was made quickly enough that it clearly reflected a pre-existing protocol for situations where content became associated with real-world tragedy in ways that the network needed to act on immediately. The episode was not available through any of these American digital channels for approximately 9 years. It was restored to Hulu in September of 2022, quietly and without announcement, without any special statement about its restoration or any explanation of why it was being returned to the platform at that specific moment, rather than some earlier or later one. What happened to Turban Cowboy illustrates something specific and important about the vulnerability of topical comedy in the media environment that had developed by 2013. The show had been making dark jokes about violence and terrorism in cutaway gags for its entire history. Those jokes existed within a frame, within the specific context of the show, and the specific register of animated comedy that the audience had been trained to read the show's content within. The frame established the material as comedy, as exaggeration, as the cartoon version of reality rather than reality itself. The audience watching the episode as broadcast understood what they were looking at. But footage stripped from its context and edited into a different configuration does not carry the original frame with it. The edited clip could be assessed on its surface by people who had no knowledge of the original episode, no familiarity with the show's register, no context for understanding what they were looking at beyond the images themselves. It looked, to someone seeing it without context, like what the narrative presenting it claimed it was: evidence that the show had depicted a bombing at the Boston Marathon, that the interpretation was false, that the clip was a fabrication, that anyone familiar with the show and with the episode would immediately recognize the edit as a manipulation, was irrelevant to the people for whom the decontextualized clip was the entire evidence they had. The Turban Cowboy situation is a small and specific case study in a larger phenomenon that shaped how broadcast media, social media, and political commentary interacted throughout the 2000s and 10s. The specific danger created by the removal of context from material that requires context in order to be correctly understood. McFarlane's response was appropriate, and the episode's removal from digital distribution was a reasonable commercial and public relations decision in the specific circumstances. The episode is available again now. The fabricated clip remains available in the places where it was uploaded and circulated. Both of those things are true simultaneously, which is itself an illustration of something about the asymmetry of damage and repair in the media environment that produced this situation. Section 10. Scenes that changed characters. Hidden depths and darkest moments. Not everything cut from Family Guy was removed because it was too offensive or too politically sensitive, or because it referenced a real-world event in a way that subsequent history had made impossible to simply broadcast. Some scenes were cut that would have added genuine and specific emotional depth to the characters involved, that would have taken the show somewhere unexpected in terms of what the audience understood about the inner lives of the people it was following. Some were cut because they made too explicit something the show had preferred to maintain at the level of implication. Some were cut for time. Some were cut because they followed an internal comedic logic to its endpoint, and the endpoint turned out to be somewhere the production concluded it could not go. Understanding the range and variety of reasons for deletion requires looking at specific cases in enough detail to see what each one was actually doing and what its removal from the broadcast version actually cost. The deleted scene from the Season 12 episode Chap Stewie is one of the most startling pieces of cut material in the show's documented history, in part because of what it reveals about the kind of material the show was producing during this period, and in part because of the specific and uncomfortable clarity with which it makes visible something the show had been doing for years at a more diffuse and less concentrated level. The episode involves an alternate timeline version of Stewie, a version who grew up in Britain, who has been introduced into the show's timeline through the mechanisms of the time travel technology that Stewie's original character was built around. In the deleted version of a scene that appears in the broadcast episode in a different form, the British Stewie enters the Griffin kitchen and fires a weapon. The weapon was aimed at the original Stewie. The bullet misses its intended target. It strikes Meg Griffin, who is present in the kitchen. She is hit. She slumps forward onto the kitchen table. She does not get up. She is, by the clear and unambiguous staging of the scene, dead. The family's response to this development is to rush to Stewie, the intended target, who may or may not have been grazed by the bullet, and who may or may not require medical attention. Nobody in the scene acknowledges Meg. Nobody goes to her. Nobody reacts to the fact that a member of their family is dead on the kitchen table. The family moves around her body as though it is not there, attending to the potentially injured Stewie with the urgency that they clearly do not extend to the daughter, who is demonstrably beyond being injured because she is already dead. The decision to cut this scene is understandable in multiple respects. The time travel mechanics of the episode provided multiple potential pathways for undoing Meg's death within the narrative logic of the story. So the practical problem of how to handle her absence from subsequent episodes was potentially solvable. The decision was probably not primarily about the narrative logistics. The specific staging of the scene, Meg dead on the kitchen table and ignored by her family while they attend to the character the bullet was meant for, is the show's entire history of treating Meg as irrelevant, concentrated into a single image, with a clarity that the dispersed cruelty of individual jokes across hundreds of episodes did not have. When the pattern was spread across many seasons and many episodes, each individual instance could be read as part of the show's general approach to family dysfunction, as dark comedy about a character type, rather than as a sustained, systematic statement about a specific character. When the same pattern was literalized into a single image of Meg dead on the table and ignored while her family moves around her, the image became a mirror for what the accumulated pattern meant, taken to its logical conclusion. The scene was cut because it showed too plainly what the joke had been all along, and showing it that plainly removed the distance that dark comedy needs to function as comedy rather than as something more uncomfortable and more troubling. The He's Black episode, involving Peter and Cleveland maintaining their friendship secretly while their wives' ongoing feud prevents open contact between the two families, produced deleted material of a different kind. The plot as broadcast follows Peter and Cleveland finding covert ways to continue spending time together, meeting at a secret location they have established for this purpose. In the deleted version of the subplot's escalation, their secret meetings become occasions for consuming increasingly extreme substances. The escalation begins with beer, the baseline substance of their friendship across the show's entire history, moves through cannabis, continues through harder substances, and arrives eventually at chemotherapy drugs, which Peter brings to one of their meetings as the next logical item in the escalating progression, not because either of them has any medical need for chemotherapy drugs, but because the comedic logic of escalation demanded the most unexpected and most extreme possible next entry in the series. Fox replaced this version of the subplot with a different configuration of how Peter and Cleveland were secretly maintaining their friendship, a configuration that did not follow the escalation to the chemotherapy endpoint. The chemotherapy endpoint is the clearest possible illustration in the show's deleted material of what happens when comedic escalation logic is followed without editorial interruption. It arrives somewhere that is technically the next step in the established pattern, but that the surrounding context of the show cannot accommodate without changing what the scene is about. Whether the specific destination the escalation reached was funny is a genuine question. It depends entirely on where the viewer is standing relative to the joke, what relationship they have with the subject matter being referenced at the endpoint, what they are bringing to the encounter with the material. Fox concluded that enough viewers would be in positions where the answer to that question was no, and replaced the sequence accordingly. The Splendid Source episode engages with a type of deleted content that is different from any of the preceding examples, because the cut is not the deletion of a scene, but the deletion of half of a joke structure. The episode's plot follows the Griffin men on a quest to find the origin of the world's dirtiest joke, an extremely filthy piece of sexual humor that the episode builds up to revealing, but whose setup and punchline are split between different versions of the episode. The broadcast version includes the punchline of the joke, delivered by a character in the climactic scene, but does not include the setup that makes the punchline make complete sense. In the broadcast version, the punchline functions as a mysterious statement whose specific meaning the viewer can infer from context and from the reactions of the characters around it, but cannot fully articulate from the information explicitly provided. This incompleteness creates a particular kind of comedy, where the audience is laughing at something that exists at the edge of their understanding, rather than at something stated directly. The punchline is funny partly because it is not quite said. The DVD version of the episode contains the complete setup, delivered by Lois, which makes entirely explicit what the punchline refers to, and in terms that are direct and specific, rather than suggestive. The decision to include the punchline while removing the setup created a broadcast version of the joke that maintained a kind of plausible deniability about exactly what was being referenced. The audience was laughing at something it could feel, rather than something it could state. Once the setup is provided, the plausible deniability disappears entirely, the joke becomes completely explicit about its subject, and the broadcast version's careful management of implication and statement dissolves. The Season 10 Seahorse Seashell Party episode, which is the episode where Meg confronts her family about how they have been treating her, in a scene that a significant portion of the show's fan base considers the most emotionally significant single moment in the show's later seasons, had material cut from its production that established additional context for Meg's state of mind going into the confrontation. The broadcast version of the scene arrives at Meg's outburst with enough setup to understand what is happening, but the deleted material provided a more detailed portrait of the specific history and the specific accumulated weight that Meg was carrying into the scene. The broadcast scene is powerful enough on its own terms. The deleted material gave it an additional dimension that its absence from the broadcast version removed. The Baby Got Black episode featured a cutaway involving Peter and a woman who was central to the legal case that became Roe v. Wade. In the cutaway, Peter had been the woman's boyfriend at the relevant moment, celebrated enthusiastically when the Supreme Court's ruling came down in a way that resolved the situation in the way he preferred, and then immediately ended the relationship with her once the outcome he wanted had been achieved. The satire was pointed at a specific and recognizable kind of hypocrisy, the stated support for reproductive rights that evaporates the moment those rights are exercised in connection with the person claiming to support them, the enthusiasm for a legal principle that disappears the moment the principle becomes personally relevant rather than abstractly theoretical. Peter is enthusiastic about the right as long as it produces the outcome he wants. He immediately discards the relationship once the outcome he wanted is secured. Fox cut the cutaway from the broadcast. The DVD includes it. The range of reasons for deletion visible across these specific examples, from the Meg death scene's uncomfortable clarity to the splendid source's management of explicitness, to the Roe v. Wade cutaway's political content, to the chemotherapy escalation's pursuit of its own internal logic, documents a show producing content at a pace and volume that meant the broadcast version was always a selection from a considerably larger creative output. The principles guiding that selection were not always primarily about quality. They were about what different contexts and different audiences and different institutional gatekeepers could accommodate. And the answer to that question varied by context, by audience, and by the specific moment in history at which the question was being asked. Section 11. 3 versions of every episode: the Fox, the cable, and the disc. Most people who have watched Family Guy seriously and sustained across multiple seasons, even people who consider themselves genuine and knowledgeable fans of the show, do not fully appreciate the degree to which the version they have been watching differs from the complete record of what was made. This is not a small or trivial distinction. Starting with the revival in 2005 and the beginning of the systematic home video bonus feature culture that accompanied it, virtually every Family Guy episode from Season 4 onward exists in at least 3 meaningfully different versions: the Fox broadcast version, the cable or Adult Swim version, the DVD version. These differ not simply in whether certain words are bleeped or whether certain images are pixelated, which are the kinds of differences most people associate with the relationship between broadcast and cable or home video. They differ in which scenes appear in the episode and which do not. They differ in which takes of specific moments of dialogue the editors used. They differ in the internal ordering of certain sequences. And in some cases, they differ on whether specific scenes exist in the episode at all, or appear in the bonus features, or are not present in the release format at all. The differences between versions did not develop accidentally or without planning on the part of the people who made the show. The 3-version structure was, to a significant degree, a deliberate strategy. The production team understood what it was dealing with in the network standards process, had been operating within that process for years, had developed the horse trading culture described in earlier sections, specifically because the negotiation between what was made and what could be broadcast required strategic thinking rather than simply accepting whatever the standards department decided. The existence of multiple distribution channels with different standards thresholds allowed the same content to reach different audiences at different levels of completeness, each appropriate to the context in which it was being distributed. The Fox broadcast version serves the largest audience and therefore operates under the most restrictive standards. It is the version that must satisfy the FCC's broadcast indecency regulations, which apply to material aired during hours when children might reasonably be expected to be in the audience, and Fox's own internal standards department, which may be more or less restrictive than the FCC's requirements, depending on the specific material and the specific moment. The Fox broadcast version is the floor of the standards hierarchy. the most edited and most modified version of each episode. The cable, or Adult Swim version, operates under cable television's generally looser standards framework, which allows content that broadcast cannot accommodate, including more explicit language, more sexually suggestive material, and in some cases, scenes that were cut from the broadcast version entirely. Adult Swim's late-night scheduling further loosens the applicable standards, since the audience watching at 11 in the evening or later is presumed to be adults who have made an active choice to watch content of this kind, rather than children who might encounter it incidentally. The Adult Swim version is therefore consistently hotter than the Fox broadcast, and in some episodes contains scenes in their complete form that the Fox version truncated or removed. The DVD version is subject only to the decisions of the production company itself, which means it is the closest available record of the creative output before the standards editing process began. The DVD contains material not present in either of the television broadcast versions. It includes deleted scenes as bonus features, and in some cases, includes an extended or unedited cut of the episode itself that restores material cut for broadcast. The DVD is the most complete archive of what was made in any given episode, and for many episodes, it contains scenes or versions of scenes that provide a meaningfully different experience of the episode than either television broadcast version. The specific examples of significant version differences have been discussed throughout these sections, but the pattern is worth naming explicitly as a pattern. The Deep Throat's couch scene existed in 3 different lengths across 3 different platforms, each calibrated to what that platform's audience and standards framework could accommodate. The PTV Douchebag segment was absent from Fox and present on the DVD. The petarded musical number appeared in the bonus features of some DVD releases, but not in any broadcast version. The When You Wish Upon a Weinstein lyric was changed for Fox broadcast and restored in DVD, and the word was visibly different on the speaker's lips from what the audio track played. The Road to Rhode Island airport sequence was cut from American releases and present on UK and German physical media. These are not isolated instances. They are examples of a consistent and systematic difference between what was made and what was allowed on different platforms. The horse trading culture that McFarlane described in DVD commentary as a regular feature of the relationship between the production and the standards department is an important element of what the deleted material represents. Some scenes were produced knowing they would probably not survive the standards process because their inclusion in the episode as submitted was part of the negotiation over what would survive. You go into the negotiation with a position that is further from what you actually want to end up with, because the negotiation is going to require you to give something up, and you want what you give up to be something you had already decided to sacrifice, rather than something you actually wanted to protect. The deleted scenes from this era are therefore not only records of what was too extreme for broadcast, they are also sometimes records of what was offered in order to protect something else, of the material that was designated as expendable before the negotiation began. International versions add yet another layer of complexity to the landscape of existing versions. The decisions made by international broadcasters about which version of a Family Guy episode to air were not always identical to the decisions made by American broadcasters, and sometimes the international release of an episode was the most complete version in existence. The Road to Rhode Island airport sequence was cut from American releases but retained in UK and German physical media. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein appeared on a UK DVD before any American outlet had broadcast or released the episode. Partial Terms of Endearment aired on BBC Three before any American viewer could see it through a legitimate channel. The principle that the American release is the canonical or most complete version of a Family Guy episode does not hold consistently across the show's history. The iTunes and streaming versions of episodes added further variation as those distribution channels became significant. Some episodes were released with the full scene restored for digital purchase. Some streaming versions were updated over time to include material that earlier streaming releases had excluded. The landscape of what version of any given episode is available through which channel at any given moment has changed across the years, as licensing arrangements changed, and as the platform's policies and the corporate structures above them changed. The effect of the 3-version structure on the experience of watching the show is significant and largely invisible to viewers who have not thought carefully about it. People who have consumed Family Guy primarily through streaming platforms have generally been watching the Fox broadcast version, since that is typically the version studios license to streaming services as their default offering. They have not seen the complete Deep Throat scene. They have not seen the full PTV douchebag segment. They have not seen the complete Road to Rhode Island. The show they know is a curated selection from a larger creative output, and the curation was done not by anyone who was primarily thinking about the artistic merit of the different versions, but by a collection of institutional actors making decisions in their own interests according to their own standards at their own moments in time. For the most dedicated fans who want to see the most complete versions of the episodes that matter most to them, navigating this landscape requires knowing which episodes have meaningful version differences, which platforms and releases contain which version, and which of those platforms and releases are currently accessible through legitimate means. Some DVD sets are out of print. Some regional releases have not been licensed to other markets. Some content exists in formats or on platforms that are difficult to access for reasons that have nothing to do with the content itself. The most complete record of Family Guy is not available in any single place or through any single format. Assembling it requires moving between multiple sources and maintaining a clear understanding of what each source contains that the others do not. Section 12. What these deleted scenes tell us about Family Guy's soul. We have spent a long time in the margins of a show that most people feel they already know well. We have followed the airport sequence that aired once in May of 2000 and became impossible to simply broadcast after September 2001. That single scene whose existence at that specific moment in the show's history sits at the intersection of creative ambition and historical accident in a way that is unlike anything else in the show's deleted material. We have traced the 4-year gap between the completion of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein and its first American broadcast, and understood that gap not as a failure of creative quality, but as evidence of the distance that exists between what a creative team intends and what institutional gatekeepers conclude will be understood. We have spent time with Partial Terms of Endearment, the only episode in the show's entire history that has never aired on American television, that exists on DVD and in reviews and in a decade and a half of critical discussion, but that remains inaccessible through any legitimate American streaming service because the commercial structure of American broadcast television made accommodating it impossible at the specific moment when it needed to be accommodated. We have looked at the Pat Tillman scene that made a truthful satirical point about institutional military failure and was cut because the public context in which that point was being made cutting it the only available decision. We have examined the Stewie musical number, cut for time from the climactic moment of the show's most dramatically ambitious two-parter, a number whose presence on the DVD makes clear what the broadcast version of that climax was missing and why the absence matters. We have traced the history of Turban Cowboy, an episode that did nothing wrong and was pulled from digital distribution for 9 years because fabricated footage created a false association between it and a real tragedy that its actual content had no connection to. We have looked at the Meg kitchen death scene and understood why it was cut in terms of what the scene revealed too plainly about what the show's ongoing treatment of that character had actually meant for years. We have navigated the 3-version landscape of Fox broadcast and Adult Swim cable and DVD release and understood that the version of the show most people have seen most of the time is a curated selection from a considerably larger creative output, and that the curation was done by institutional processes serving institutional interests rather than by anyone whose primary concern was identifying the artistically superior version of each episode and presenting it to the audience. What does all of this material tell us, taken together as a body of evidence about a specific show across a specific period of television history? The first and most fundamental thing it tells us is simple, but worth stating explicitly because it is easy to overlook. The Family Guy that exists in public memory, and in streaming libraries, and in syndication packages, the show that millions of people have spent meaningful amounts of their lives watching, and that influenced a generation of animated comedy, and that produced a body of cultural reference points that persist in conversation among people who have never watched a complete episode. That show is a curated selection from a larger body of creative work. The decisions that shaped that selection were made by many different people, at many different times, for many different reasons. Creative quality was one of those reasons, but it was not always the primary one, and it was frequently secondary to commercial considerations, institutional risk calculations, regulatory requirements, and the decisions of specific powerful individuals at specific institutions at specific historical moments. The show we know is not exactly the show that was made. Understanding it fully means knowing something about what was left out and why. The second thing the deleted and censored material tells us is about the character and quality of the show's creative ambition across different periods of its history. And here, the pattern that emerges is one of meaningful change over time that matters for understanding why the show is remembered so differently by people who encountered it at different points in its run. The scenes cut during the original 3 seasons and the early revival period through approximately seasons 4, 5, and 6 were almost invariably cut from material that was genuinely reaching for something. The Pat Tillman scene was making a specific and truthful satirical point about institutional military failure that the public context made it impossible to broadcast. The Stewie musical number was giving the show's most original character his fullest possible showcase at the culminating moment of his arc. The Bin Laden airport gag was commentary on security theater that had the profound misfortune to be made in a world that was 15 months from proving the gag's underlying observation catastrophically correct. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, approved by 2 rabbis and written by a Jewish writer, was constructed to criticize the prejudice it was depicting and was censored because the satirical structure was not legible enough to the institutional gatekeepers reviewing it. These early deleted scenes were cut from content that had a clear creative purpose and that was doing something specific and intentional with its extremity. The transgression was in service of something. The later deleted material shows a different relationship between extremity and purpose. The chemotherapy escalation in He's Black follows an internal comedic logic to an endpoint without the endpoint illuminating anything beyond the fact that the escalation has reached an extreme destination. The Meg Kitchen death scene's extremity made visible something the show was better at maintaining as implication, which is an observation about the creative achievement of the scene, but also an observation about the creative problem it was addressing. The douchebag segment cut from PTV was the right scene to cut from a standards negotiation perspective, but was also exactly the wrong scene to cut given what the episode was arguing. And the irony of that simultaneous rightness and wrongness is more interesting than either one of those evaluations alone. The third thing this material reveals is about the specific relationship between creative freedom and institutional constraint that defined the show's entire existence, a relationship more complicated and more interesting than either the show's defenders or its critics tended to acknowledge. Family Guy was built around the premise of going further than television normally went. The show's reputation and a significant part of its cultural identity were constructed around that premise. The creators argued for it publicly, defended specific episodes and specific scenes against network pressure, made the case in interviews and commentary tracks that the freedom to push toward the uncomfortable and the outrageous was not merely a commercial or provocative strategy, but a genuine creative and even moral position about what comedy could and should do. But that premise could not have fully existed without the constraints it was pushing against. The show's reputation for going further was dependent on there being a line that could be approached, and approaching the line required the line to exist. The 3-version structure that developed over time was the show's practical acknowledgement that different audiences existed at different distances from the content, and that the content itself existed on a spectrum that different versions made accessible to different degrees. The deleted and censored material is the evidence of where the edges of that spectrum were located at different moments in the show's history. None of those edges were fixed. All of them moved. Some moved deliberately, offered up in negotiations as calculated sacrifices to protect other material. Some moved because the standards process made specific decisions in specific contexts that might have been different in different circumstances. Some moved because the world outside the show changed in ways that made certain material impossible to broadcast regardless of the creative standards process. September 11th and the Boston Marathon bombing being the clearest examples of this kind of external movement. The deleted scenes are not only a record of what was cut, they are a record of where the edges were at each moment and how they moved. The fourth thing worth noting is something about the specific and particular losses the deleted and censored material represents for the show's legacy. The show, at its best, was doing something that required all of its elements to be working simultaneously. The character depth and the warmth and the dark humor and the structural ambition and the creative risk-taking. When any one of those elements was absent or compromised, the show worked less well. The deleted scenes document specific moments where elements that the show needed were present in the production and not present in the broadcast. Where the broadcast version of an episode was doing the work with one hand tied behind its back, because the other hand was holding material the standards process had required it to put down. The Stewie musical number is probably the clearest example of this specific kind of loss. The episode it came from was trying to do something dramatically ambitious, trying to give a character's 8-year arc a climax proportionate to what that arc had been building toward. The musical number was part of how the episode was making the climax feel proportionate. Without it, the climax was proportionate enough to work, but not proportionate enough to feel like the full realization of what the episode was reaching for. Knowing the number was made and was cut because the episode was running long, not because it was too extreme or too offensive or too politically sensitive, but simply because it was too long, is a specific and minor frustration that nevertheless tells you something real about the relationship between what the show was trying to be and what the institutional structures around it allowed it to be. The fifth and final thing, the one worth ending on, is something about why any of this matters and why it is worth the time we have spent on it. There is a specific kind of attention that deleted and censored content invites. It is the attention of someone who suspects that the official version of something is not the complete version, who has the persistent feeling that knowing what was left out would change their understanding of what remains. It is the attention of someone who understands that the process of making something, the decisions about what to include and what to remove and why, is itself part of the meaning of the finished work, and that understanding those decisions is part of understanding the work in its full context. It is the attention of someone who knows that the version of a thing they have access to was shaped by forces and interests and decisions that had nothing to do with what would make the thing most artistically complete, and who wants to get as close as possible to the version that those forces and interests and decisions were shaping. Family Guy rewards this attention in ways that many shows do not, precisely because its history of deleted and censored content is unusually well documented in some periods and genuinely and permanently mysterious in others, because its relationship with the standards and practices process produced a specific and traceable record of where different institutional edges were located at different historical moments. Because the creator's own retrospective reflections on some of the cut material give us his evaluation of what those choices meant. Because the show's intersection with real-world events created cases where the external world was the thing doing the cutting, rather than any production decision. And because the show's existence across multiple platform types with different standards thresholds created a systematic and ongoing record of how the same material was treated differently by different institutional contexts. Exploring this material is not simply an exercise in curiosity about what was too extreme for television. It is an exploration of how creative work and institutional context interact over time, how the same material means different things in different settings, how history can change the significance of something that was made before the history that changed its significance occurred, how the version of something that was made and the version that was shown can diverge in ways that are interesting and illuminating regardless of which version is artistically superior. The scenes we have explored tonight are not all lost. They exist on DVDs and in international streaming libraries and in archival documents and in communities devoted to preserving and understanding the show's history in its fullest form. They are waiting, in their various formats and various degrees of accessibility, in the places that the broadcast version could not follow them. If you want to see the more complete version of something you thought you already knew, that material is worth finding. It will show you a version of the show that is sometimes more ambitious, sometimes darker, sometimes funnier, sometimes more uncomfortable, and always more honest about what the people who made it were actually reaching for, before the forces that shape what television is allowed to be decided what they would allow it to show you. The show that was made is not quite the same as the show you have seen. It is larger and stranger and more complicated than the version that reached you. And the gap between those two things, that persistent and revealing gap, is what makes digging into the history of what was cut and why one of the more genuinely interesting ways to spend time with a show you thought you already understood. The show's legacy is built on what made it to air, but the show's complete identity includes what didn't make it, what was argued over and sacrificed and modified and removed and set aside in the years of production that produced the public record. The complete show is the sum of both, and the work of understanding it fully is the work of holding both parts in mind simultaneously, the public record and the hidden one, the version that was broadcast and the version that was made, the show that exists in streaming libraries and the show that exists in DVDs and archives and foreign releases and the memories of the people who made it. Family Guy was, in its best years, one of the most ambitious and most interesting animated comedies produced in American television. The ambition that made it best is visible in the deleted material more clearly than it is visible in any other part of its history. The scenes that survived the gauntlet are evidence of what the medium would allow. The scenes that didn't survive are evidence of what the creative team was actually reaching for. And the gap between those two things is, ultimately, the most honest measure of what the show was. The creative people who made the early seasons of Family Guy were working at the edges of what their medium would permit. And the things that ended up at the edges and beyond were not there by accident. They were there because the people making the show believed that the edges were where the most interesting and most honest comedy lived, and that staying safely away from the edges was a way of making something less than what comedy could be. That belief is documented in the deleted material more completely than anywhere else. And whether you agree with the belief or not, the fact that the people who held it were also capable of making something as fine as Road to Rhode Island and Stewie Kills Lois and PTV and Brian and Stewie is evidence that the belief was connected to real creative capacity and not just to the pleasures of transgression for its own sake. The hidden show is the evidence of what creativity looks like when it is most fully itself, before the institutional machinery of broadcast television has finished with it. It is worth knowing about, it is worth finding, and it is worth sitting with in whatever quiet hour you have found for yourself, with the same patient attention that the best of what the show actually made has always deserved. There is something specific that the people who worked on the deleted scenes of Family Guy deserve to have said about their work. And it is something that gets lost when the deleted material is treated purely as a curiosity or as evidence of how far the show was willing to go. The scenes that were cut, particularly in the show's strongest creative years, were not failures. They were not scenes that didn't work, or that the writers were embarrassed by, or that the creative team wanted forgotten. They were scenes that worked, that were doing what they were supposed to do, and that the institutional structures around the show concluded could not be shown to the audience for reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of the work. The writers who wrote the Pat Tillman scene made something that was, by the account of the person arguably most entitled to an opinion about it, a fair and even sympathetic piece of satirical commentary about the institutional failure that had led to a soldier's death and the subsequent concealment of that death by the institution responsible. The animators who animated the Stewie I've Got a Little List number made a piece of musical comedy production that was fully realized and complete, and that gave the show's most original character a moment of theatrical grandeur at the culmination of his 8-year arc. The writers who wrote When You Wish Upon a Weinstein made a piece of satirical comedy about prejudice that 2 rabbis found acceptable, and that critics who eventually saw it found to be a reasonably fair-minded and intelligent treatment of its subject. None of these were failures. They were creative successes that the institutional machinery around the show was unable or unwilling to show the audience. Holding that fact in mind, alongside the fact that some of the deleted material was cut for much less interesting reasons, for time, or for commercial caution, or because the escalation logic had arrived somewhere that produced no light, only heat, is what gives the complete picture of the show's hidden history, its full and honest complexity. Not all of the deleted material deserves the same response. Not all of it was cut because it was good. But the best of it, the material that was reaching furthest, the material that the creative team fought hardest to protect, that material deserves to be known and to be taken seriously as evidence of what the people who made this show were actually capable of and what they were actually trying to do. The Hidden Show is a record of ambition, incomplete, imperfectly preserved, scattered across formats and archives and foreign releases and the memories of the people who were in the room, but real. and worth the time it takes to find it. There is one final thing worth saying about the experience of watching Family Guy with full knowledge of the deleted material alongside the broadcast version. And it is something that goes beyond research or completeness and into the territory of how we actually watch and understand creative work. Knowing that the complete show is larger than the show you have seen changes the relationship you have with what you are watching. It does not make every episode better or worse. It does not transform the later seasons into something they were not. But it makes the show more honest, in a way that matters. The show that exists with its deleted material acknowledged and understood is a show that is being seen for what it actually was. A creative project operating under constraints, negotiating those constraints with varying degrees of success, producing work whose quality was uneven, but whose ambition, in its best years, was genuine and significant and connected to a real and considered point of view about what comedy could do and where it needed to go to do it. The people who made the early Family Guy were not simply trying to be outrageous. They were trying to make something that went where other things didn't go, because they believed that the places other things didn't go were the places where something real and valuable was waiting to be found. The deleted material is the record of how far they pushed in that direction before the institutional machinery of broadcast television stopped them. And the distance they covered before being stopped, even in the incomplete and fragmentary record that survives, is considerable and worth knowing about. Watching the show you think you know, with the awareness of the show that was made, changes the experience of watching. Not dramatically, not in every moment, but in the moments that matter most, in the episodes that were reaching hardest for something, in the scenes where the creative team was pushing against the edges most directly. The awareness of the deleted material gives the broadcast version a different kind of depth. You are watching something that you now understand was chosen from a larger set of possibilities, that the shape it has is the shape it was allowed to have, rather than necessarily the shape it was intended to have, and that the shape it was intended to have is documented, incompletely, but really, in the places we have been visiting throughout this exploration. That is the lasting value of knowing about the hidden show. Not the individual deleted scenes in themselves, though those matter, but the understanding that the show you love was always something larger than what you were given access to, and that getting closer to the larger version is worth the effort of going looking for it in the places where it actually lives. The deleted material also serves as a reminder of something that is easy to forget when watching a show that has been running for 25 years and has produced more than 400 episodes, and that has become, in the way that enormously long-running cultural artifacts do, more of a background presence than a show that makes specific demands on your attention. It is easy to forget that the show was once made with urgency, with the specific urgency of creative people who believed they were making something important, and who were fighting for the right to make it the way they believed it needed to be made. The deleted material from the show's best years is saturated with that urgency. The horse trading over specific scenes, the appeals to standards departments about specific decisions, the deliberate sacrifice of material in order to protect other material, the public advocacy against decisions that the creator believed were wrong. All of that was urgency. All of that was the product of people who cared deeply and specifically about what the show was and what it was allowed to be. That urgency was not permanent. Creative urgency rarely is, especially in a project that runs for 25 years. The later deleted material reflects a different relationship between the creative team and the work, a relationship in which the urgency had dissipated and the institutional negotiations had become routine, and the specific scenes being protected were not always the scenes most worth protecting. The Conway Twitty deletions and the later violence-related cuts document a different creative situation than the early battle over When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. Both a part of the record, both tell you something real about the show at the moment when they were made. But what you carry away from the full history of the deleted material, if you have spent enough time with it to see it whole, is the urgency of the early years more than anything else. Because the urgency is where the show's identity lives most fully, where the connection between what it was trying to do and what the people who made it believed about comedy was most directly expressed. And the deleted material from those years is the place where that connection is most visible, most unmediated, most clearly itself. It is the record of people reaching for something real, and that record, incomplete as it is is worth everything the time it takes to find it. And that is where we end tonight. A long and careful walk through the hidden history of a show that most people think they know well, and that turns out, on closer examination, to have been a considerably more complicated and more interesting creative project than the version most of its audience has been able to access. If something we covered tonight surprised you, drop it in the comments. If you have spent time in the deleted scene sections of the DVDs yourself and found something you think belongs in a conversation like this one, tell us what you found. Tell us where in the world you are and what time it is as you finish this. And tell me which deleted scene or censored episode you think deserves more attention than it currently gets. If you are not subscribed yet, please do that before you close this out. There is a lot more of this kind of patient and careful exploration coming, the kind that takes its time with subjects that deserve the time. Until next time, take good care of yourself. Sleep well. Section 13. The Conway-Twitty Problem. When lazy deletion tells its own story. There is a category of deleted and cut material in the Family Guy archive that we have not yet discussed, and it represents a fundamentally different kind of evidence than everything we have examined so far. Most of the scenes and episodes and sequences covered in the preceding sections were cut because they went somewhere the institutional structures around the show could not follow, because they were too politically charged or too culturally sensitive, or because the world outside the show had changed in ways that made broadcasting them impossible. They were, in other words, cut because they were reaching for something that the system could not accommodate. There is another category of deleted material that was cut for the opposite reason, not because the content was too extreme, but because the content was not doing anything at all, was filling time that the writing room could not fill with actual comedy, and existed as evidence of the opposite of creative ambition. The Conway-Twitty gag is the most notorious example of this category, and spending time with it is necessary for any honest account of what the show's deleted and cut material actually represents across its full history. The Conway-Twitty gag appeared multiple times across several seasons of the show. Its structure was simple to the point of being nothing. Instead of a cutaway gag or a comedic scene, the show would simply cut to footage of Conway-Twitty, the country singer and songwriter who died in 1993, performing one of his songs. Not a brief clip, not a comedic framing that used the footage to make a point. A full, unedited performance of a Conway-Twitty song, lasting for an extended period of time, during which the audience was expected to simply wait for it to end before the episode continued. The first time this appeared, the unexpectedness of it was itself a kind of joke. The audience did not know what was happening or how long it would last, and the uncertainty was productive. By the second time, the element of surprise was gone. By the third and fourth time, the gag had become widely discussed as one of the laziest things ever broadcast on network television. What the Conway-Twitty gag represented was the cutaway format taken to its logical and most honest conclusion. The cutaway gag in its later seasons was already being used as a way of filling time that the writing room could not fill with story, or with character, or with comedy that came from the characters or the situation. The cutaway allowed the show to substitute a disconnected random joke for actual writing. The Conway-Twitty gag removed even the pretense of a joke and simply put a country song in the place where something was supposed to happen. Several Conway-Twitty performances were cut from broadcast versions of episodes that contained them, either because they ran too long to fit in the broadcast slot, or because the standards department concluded that even a full, unedited performance of a Conway-Twitty song should not be what primetime network television was doing on a Sunday night. These cuts produced a specific kind of deleted material, recordings that were not cut because they were too extreme, but because they were not enough. They were deleted because the space where a scene was supposed to be was occupied by a country song, and at some point in the editing process, someone had to acknowledge that this was not sufficient. The Conway-Twitty deletions are part of a larger pattern of later season cut material that reflects a different creative situation than the early deleted scenes. When the writing room was producing at its best, the material that was cut because it was reaching further than the institutional structures around the show could follow. When the writing room was struggling, the material that was sometimes cut because it was reaching nowhere at all, was filling space because the space needed to be filled, and the filling did not require it to be good. Understanding this pattern is important for any honest account of what the deleted material documents across the show's full history. The early deleted scenes are evidence of creative ambition operating at the edges of what the medium would allow. The later deleted material includes, alongside genuinely interesting cut content, evidence of a different kind of creative situation, one where the edges were less about what was too good for broadcast and more about what was not good enough to justify being there at all. Both kinds of evidence are part of the complete picture. The Conway-Twitty gag also became the most frequently cited example in a specific kind of meta-commentary that the show developed in its later years, the habit of making jokes about its own creative problems rather than solving those problems. The show knew the Conway-Twitty gag was not comedy. It knew the cutaway format had become a crutch. It made jokes about these things, built episodes around self-aware acknowledgement of its own creative habits, developed a posture of ironic self-commentary that positioned the show as knowing about its problems even while perpetuating those problems. The gap between knowing about a creative failure and being willing to correct it is the gap that the show inhabited for a significant portion of its later seasons. The deleted material from those years documents both sides of that gap. Section 14. The Writer's Strike and its Hidden Cost. How Disruption Created Deletions. The Writers Guild of America strike of 2007 and 2008 disrupted virtually every scripted television program on the air at the time, and Family Guy was among the shows most significantly affected by that disruption. Understanding how the strike created a specific category of deleted material and how it changed the creative environment that produced the show requires understanding what the strike was about and how it changed the conditions under which the writing room operated in the years that followed. The strike began in November of 2007 and ended on February 12th of 2008, running for approximately 100 days. The central issues were residuals for writing work used in new media, specifically digital distribution and DVD sales. The television industry was in the middle of a transition that was moving content from physical media and broadcast toward digital distribution, and the writers were fighting for a share of the revenue from that transition that the major studios and networks were not prepared to offer on terms the Writers Guild found acceptable. Seth MacFarlane was a strong and visible supporter of the striking writers, appearing on picket lines and making public statements in support of the Guild's position. His support was consistent with positions he had taken throughout his career about the importance of writers' rights and about the power dynamics within the television industry. Fox made the decision during the strike to broadcast 3 episodes of Family Guy that had already been completed before the work stoppage began. The episodes existed. The broadcast contracts covering them gave Fox the technical right to air them. MacFarlane objected to the decision, which put those already completed episodes on the air over his objection and against his expressed preferences. The tension this created between MacFarlane and Fox was not resolved by the ending of the strike, and contributed to the broader deterioration of his relationship with the network that would become public and explicit in the years that followed. The strike's effect on the writing room was significant in terms of what it produced in the months following its conclusion. Television writers work on long planning horizons. Story arcs are developed across seasons. Character decisions made in one episode depend on decisions made in episodes that will follow it, and those future episodes need to be in at least conceptual development while the current episodes are in production. When the strike interrupted this planning process for 100 days and then ended, the writing rooms across American television did not simply resume from where they had paused. The rhythm of the creative work had been broken in ways that required time and effort to restore, and the material produced in the immediate post-strike period reflected the disruption of that rhythm in ways that were visible to attentive viewers and that left traces in the pattern of what was produced and what was cut. The deleted material from the Season 6 episodes that straddled the strike period reflects the disruption in specific ways. Several episodes from this period have deleted scenes that feel disconnected from the episodes they were cut from in ways that suggest they were written or conceived in a different creative moment than the episodes themselves, that they came from the planning that was in place before the disruption, and that no longer fit coherently into the episodes that the post-strike writing room was completing. The disconnection is not always dramatic. It is sometimes simply a scene that does not quite belong where it was placed, that the editing process recognized as not belonging and removed accordingly. The strike also contributed to the restaffing problem that MacFarlane had identified as one of the persistent consequences of the show's difficult early history. Writers who had been part of the Family Guy writing room moved to other projects during the strike, and some of them did not return to Family Guy when the strike ended. New writers came in. The introduction of new writers midstream into a production that was already mid-season created a specific kind of tonal inconsistency that the editing process was not always sufficient to smooth out. And some of the scenes cut from this period reflect the product of writers who were still finding their relationship to the show's specific voice and specific register. The longer-term consequence of the strike for the show's deleted material was perhaps most visible in the accelerating pace of certain creative trends that the disruption gave additional momentum to. The reliance on the cutaway format as a way of filling time without requiring sustained story construction had been growing before the strike. The disruption of the writing room's rhythm and the subsequent restaffing made the creative discipline required to sustain genuine story construction across a full episode harder to maintain, and the cutaway format offered a structural alternative to that discipline that became more attractive under the conditions the strike created. Some of what was deleted in the post-strike seasons was deleted because the story construction it was supposed to support was not strong enough to hold the scenes in place, and the scenes themselves, while sometimes individually funny, did not belong in episodes whose plots they had no genuine connection to. Understanding the strike's legacy for the show's deleted material requires placing it within the larger arc of the show's creative history, rather than treating it as an isolated event with isolated consequences. The strike accelerated trends that were already present. It created conditions that made certain existing creative problems more visible and more difficult to address. And it contributed to the documentary record of what was made and not used in ways that continued to be visible in the pattern of the deleted material from the seasons that followed it. Section 15. The MacFarlane Voice Booth and What Happened Behind the Microphone. There is one dimension of the deleted material that gets relatively little attention, and that is worth pausing on before we conclude, which is the question of what happens to the voice performances in scenes that are cut before broadcast. Seth MacFarlane voices 4 principal characters in Family Guy. He is Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. These are not small or peripheral characters. They are, collectively, the central axis around which the show's comedy rotates. Virtually every episode contains substantial material featuring at least 2 of these characters, and most episodes contain material with 3 or all 4 of them. MacFarlane's vocal range and his ability to maintain the specific and distinct personalities of 4 very different characters simultaneously across more than 2 decades of recording sessions is one of the genuine technical achievements of the show's production history. When a scene is cut from an episode, MacFarlane's recorded performance of those lines is cut with it. The performance exists in the audio files from the recording session. It may be archived or it may not be, depending on the production's practices at the specific moment and the specific administrative decisions made about what audio material is worth preserving versus what can be let go once the editing decision has been made. Some of the deleted scenes that are available on DVD include the original voice recording from the session, with MacFarlane performing the lines the way he performed them in the booth on the day, without the knowledge of whether this specific take would survive to broadcast. Some deleted scenes were re-recorded for the DVD release, with performances that may differ from the original recording session take. The difference between a first recording and a re-recorded take can be significant in comedy. The timing is slightly different, the specific choices made about emphasis and pace, and the small variations in delivery that make a joke land or not land are choices that are made in a specific moment under specific conditions, and reproducing those conditions in a subsequent session is not the same as having been in the session where the original was recorded. The deleted scenes available on DVD are therefore not always the most accurate record of what the performance in the cutscene would have sounded like if the scene had been broadcast. They are sometimes a record of what the performance sounded like when it was reconstructed for the home video release. This distinction matters most for the scenes where performance is most central to whether the comedy works. A visual cutaway gag whose comedy depends primarily on what the animation is doing, rather than on the specific delivery of a spoken line, is relatively unaffected by whether the audio was recorded in the original session or re-recorded for the DVD. A scene where a character is delivering a speech, where the comedy depends on the timing of specific words and the specific vocal choices made in performing them, is more significantly affected by whether the performance is original or reconstructed. MacFarlane's performances of the Brian and Stewie characters in particular depend on specific and delicate timing choices that the character's comedy is built on. Brian's dry observation after a Peter disaster requires a specific pace and a specific absence of emotional color in the delivery to work the way the writers intend. Stewie's theatrical declarations require the specific commitment and the specific tone of the evil genius baby register, the register that MacFarlane established in the earliest episodes and maintained with remarkable consistency across the show's entire run, even as the character's personality changed. When scenes containing these performances were cut and then reconstructed for DVD bonus features, the reconstruction was accomplished by a performer who had been doing these voices for years and who knew them intimately. But the original session take, in the cases where it differs meaningfully from the reconstruction, is the more complete record of what the scene would have been. The voice performance dimension of the deleted material is a reminder that the scenes we are discussing were not simply written on a page and then cut from the page. They were made, fully made, in recording booths and animation studios and editing suites, by people who invested time and craft and specific performance choices into them. The deleted scenes are not just texts. They are recordings, artifacts of specific performances on specific days by people who were making something and who, in most cases, did not know whether what they were making would make it to broadcast. The existence of those artifacts, even in their sometimes reconstructed and modified form on DVD bonus features, is the closest thing we have to the complete record of what was made during the show's production history. And the incompleteness of that record, the places where the artifacts do not exist or cannot be accessed or were never systematically preserved, is the most honest measure we have of the gap between the show that was made and the show that was allowed to exist. Section 16. Animated violence and what the censors actually cared about. One of the more surprising patterns in the history of Family Guy's deleted and censored material is the relative inconsistency with which animated violence was treated compared to sexual content and political content across different periods of the show's relationship with Fox's standards department. The show's violence was always cartoonish in its early seasons, operating in the register that has been standard for animated comedy since the medium's earliest years. Characters were hit and fell and got up. Peter crashed into things and survived. The giant chicken fights that became a recurring element of the show's action comedy vocabulary involved sustained and escalating physical combat that would be lethal in any realistic context, but that was presented in the broad and exaggerated register of animation that signals to the audience that the physical consequences of what they are watching are not operating in the same register as real physical consequences. As the seasons progressed, the show's violence became more extreme in specific ways. The level of physical damage depicted became more detailed and more realistic in certain scenes. Characters were shown with injuries described in a level of anatomical specificity that shifted the register away from cartoon violence and toward something that the audience was expected to process differently. Peter's physical interactions with other characters became more genuinely harmful in their staging, less clearly exaggerated to the point of being obviously not real. The standards department's response to this escalation was inconsistent in ways that the show's production team noticed and that appear in the documentary record of the deleted material. Scenes depicting violence at a level that seemed extreme were sometimes cut and sometimes not cut, seemingly without a consistent principle that distinguished the cases where deletion was required from the cases where it was not. A scene involving a character being injured in a specific way in one episode might clear the standards process, while a scene involving the same character being injured in a comparable way in a different episode might be cut. The inconsistency reflected the nature of the review process, which was conducted by human beings making judgment calls in specific contexts rather than by a rule set that could be applied automatically and consistently. The deleted material involving violence from the later seasons includes some scenes where the extremity of what was depicted was genuinely beyond what the show should have been doing, and where the cut was clearly the right decision, and some scenes where the cut seems to have been made on inconsistent grounds, given what the show was simultaneously allowing in other episodes. The pattern suggests that the standards process was responding to specific content in specific contexts, rather than applying a consistent and principled framework across the full body of material it was reviewing. What the violence-related deleted material tells us about the show's later seasons more broadly is something about the drift in creative ambition that the other evidence documents through different angles. The escalation of violence in the show's later seasons was not, in most cases, connected to any satirical or comedic purpose of the kind that animated the most effective dark comedy in the show's earlier years. The violence was escalating because escalation was what the writers had available when the other creative tools were not working, when the character development was thin and the story construction was weak, and the cutaway format was doing most of the work, and the show needed something that would produce a strong reaction from the audience. Violence was one of the available tools for producing a strong reaction. The escalation in the violence-related deleted material across the later seasons is therefore evidence, from an unusual angle, of the same creative situation that the escalation in the Conway Twitty gag and the proliferation of low-effort cutaways and the deterioration of character consistency were evidence of, from their respective angles. The standards process was responding to symptoms. The underlying condition was something that the standards process was not designed to address, and that the deletion of specific violent scenes was not sufficient to correct. Understanding the relationship between the show's violence-related deleted material and the broader creative trajectory of the show's later seasons requires holding both kinds of evidence simultaneously: the evidence from the content of the deleted scenes themselves, and the evidence from the pattern of what was escalating in the broadcast material during the same period. The deleted scenes document what was too extreme for broadcast. The broadcast material documents what was not too extreme for broadcast. Together they describe the creative environment in which both kinds of material were being produced, and the environment they describe is one in which the tools of transgression and extremity had become substitutes for the creative tools that were not working, rather than complements to those tools the way they had been in the show's strongest years. Section 17. The International Archive. What other countries were allowed to see? The story of Family Guy's deleted and censored content has an international dimension that is easy to overlook if you are approaching the show's history primarily from an American perspective, and overlooking it means missing some of the most instructive evidence available about where the limits that shaped the show's content actually came from and what they actually represented. Different countries have different standards for what broadcast and cable television can show, different regulatory frameworks, different cultural contexts in which the same material is encountered and evaluated, and different commercial relationships between broadcasters and advertisers that shape what content broadcasters are willing to defend. When a company like Fox distributes its content internationally, those differences become visible in the specific and documented ways that different countries receive different versions of the same episodes. The United Kingdom received Family Guy through BBC Three, which had acquired the broadcast rights for the United Kingdom and Ireland, and which operated within the BBC's regulatory framework under Ofcom, the UK's communications regulator. The BBC's approach to the show differed from Fox's approach in ways that were consequential for what British audiences saw. The BBC made its own decisions about when to air the show and what materials to accompany the broadcast with. When Partial Terms of Endearment was produced and Fox declined to broadcast it, BBC Three made the independent decision to air it as part of its regular programming. The episode that the American Broadcast Network found too commercially risky to put on the air was simply another episode for the BBC, broadcast to its regular audience without extraordinary preparation or controversy. This difference was not primarily about a different regulatory standard in the UK, being more permissive about the depiction of abortion. The Ofcom regulatory framework for content broadcast on UK television is not dramatically more permissive about sensitive social and political topics than the FCC's framework for American broadcast television. The difference was about the specific cultural and political weight that abortion carries in American public discourse versus the weight it carries in British public discourse, and about the specific commercial vulnerabilities that an American broadcaster faces when it airs content associated with the most politically charged topic in American culture versus the vulnerabilities that a British public broadcaster faces in the same situation. The BBC did not have the same exposure to advertiser withdrawal that Fox had, both because of its funding model and because the cultural and political landscape in which it was operating did not make abortion the same kind of organizing political issue that it is in the United States. Germany presents a different and somewhat less obvious example. The German physical media releases of Family Guy, specifically the DVD releases of the early seasons, made different decisions about what material to include than the American releases made. The German release of the second season included the Road to Rhode Island airport sequence featuring Osama bin Laden performing I Hope I Get It, which was cut from the American Volume 1 DVD release. The German decision to include the sequence was not the product of German insensitivity to the September 11th attacks or to their aftermath. Germany was a country that experienced the attacks as a significant and traumatic event, and that was a close ally of the United States in the responses that followed. The decision to include the sequence in the German DVD release was most likely a distribution decision, a decision about which edit of the episode to include in the physical media package, made without the same intense awareness of the specific cultural weight the sequence carried in the American context, and without the same institutional pressure to remove it that the American release faced. Australian releases of the show produced their own set of divergences from the American standard. Certain episodes that the American broadcast version modified were available in Australia in versions closer to the production originals. The specific differences between the Australian releases and the American releases document the same kind of pattern visible in the UK and German cases. The decisions about what to modify and what to leave intact were being made by different institutional actors in different cultural contexts, making different assessments of the same material. And those different assessments produce different products in different markets. The existence of these international versions matters for the history of the show's deleted material for several reasons. First, they provide access to material that would otherwise be unavailable to audiences in countries where the more restrictive version was the only version commercially released, and some of that material is genuinely worth having access to. Second, they serve as evidence about where the limits imposed on the American versions of the episodes actually came from. The limits were not absolute, were not required by some universal standard of what television could show, were not the inevitable consequence of the content itself. They were the products of specific institutional decisions made by specific actors in specific cultural and commercial contexts. The same content that was too extreme or too commercially risky for American broadcast was simply content for broadcasters in other countries, available to be shown to audiences who received it without the catastrophic consequences that American broadcasters feared. Third, the international versions document the specific cultural embeddedness of many of the show's censorship decisions. The things that were too sensitive for American broadcast were not equally sensitive in every cultural context. Some were specific to the American political landscape. Some were specific to the American commercial broadcast model and its particular vulnerabilities to advertiser pressure. Some were specific to moments in American history that gave certain material a weight and a charge in the American context that the same material did not carry elsewhere. Understanding this cultural embeddedness is part of understanding what the censorship decisions actually were and what they were actually responding to. The International Archive also functions as a kind of alternative history of the show, a record of what Family Guy looked like to audiences who were not subject to the specific constraints that shaped the American version. That alternative history is not dramatically different from the American version in most episodes. The differences are concentrated in specific moments and specific episodes where the American constraints were most tightly applied. But in those concentrated moments, the international versions provide a glimpse of a version of the show that was slightly more complete, slightly more willing to go where its creators intended it to go, slightly closer to the show that was made, rather than the show that was allowed to exist. For researchers and dedicated fans trying to assemble the most complete possible picture of what Family Guy was in its full creative form, the International Archive is a necessary and irreplaceable part of the evidence base. It fills gaps that the American Archive leaves open, documents material that the American releases chose not to preserve, and provides the comparative perspective necessary to understand what the American constraints were actually doing and what they were actually responding to. It is part of the answer to the question we have been asking throughout this entire exploration. What was the show that was made, and how does it differ from the show that most of its audience has been allowed to see? Section 18. What stays with you? The lasting weight of the hidden show. We have been exploring the hidden record of Family Guy for a long time now, moving through deleted scenes and censored episodes and cut material and international variations and production fragments, and the specific stories of how individual pieces of content encountered the forces that shaped what could and could not be broadcast. Before we close, it is worth pausing and asking what the lasting significance of all of this actually is. Not for the purposes of research or completeness, but for the purposes of understanding what it means to have spent this time with the material. The answer that the evidence keeps returning to is something about the gap between intention and reception that defines the experience of all creative work that passes through institutional systems on its way to an audience. The people who made Family Guy in its best years were making something, were reaching for something, were exercising a kind of creative ambition that the deleted material documents at its most extended and its most unconstrained. That ambition was never fully visible to the audience that encountered the finished show, because the finished show was not the made show. It was the survived show, the version that had made it through the institutional gauntlet and arrived at the audience in the form that the institutions had decided the audience could have. Understanding the deleted material is understanding what the ambition looked like before the gauntlet got hold of it. It is understanding the show's creative intentions in their fullest form, rather than in the form that the commercial and regulatory and cultural constraints allowed to survive. And that understanding changes the show retrospectively. It does not make the broadcast version better or worse than it is on its own terms. It makes it more legible. It allows the show to be seen as what it was, a creative project operating within a set of constraints, negotiating those constraints with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of strategic intelligence, producing a body of work that the audience could only partially access because the institutions between the creation and the audience had their own stakes in what the audience was allowed to see. The weight of the hidden show is not primarily the weight of any individual deleted scene or censored episode, though individual scenes and episodes carry their own specific gravity. It is the weight of knowing that the version of the thing you love is not the complete version, that the thing was larger than what you were given, that somewhere in the archive of what was made there are pieces that would change your understanding of what remains if you could see them fully. That knowledge is both a frustration and an invitation. A frustration because the gaps cannot always be filled, because some of what was made is simply gone and will not come back. And an invitation because the gaps that can be filled are filled by real material that is still out there, waiting, on DVDs and in international archives, and in the documented testimony of the people who were in the room when it was made. The invitation, ultimately, is to approach the show you think you know with the awareness that there is more to it than you have seen, and that getting closer to the fuller version of it is possible if you are willing to look in the places where the fuller version is actually located. The hidden show is not entirely hidden. It is distributed across formats and regions and archives and commentary tracks in ways that make it accessible to people who are willing to go looking for it. And going looking for it is, in the end, the most honest way to respect what was made.